Chapter 1251, Rude Awakening. With nightmare guarding Sunny's dreams, his sleep was deep and peaceful. His awakening, however, was not. What? Sunny woke from feeling the world tilt and then quake with a violent shudder. He was thrown sideways and collided with the slope of the fissure, feeling the sharp rocks cutting into his skin. Groggy and disoriented, he tried to stand up, but got tangled in the sleeping bag instead. Damn it! The sleeping bag disintegrated as he tore through it, already summoning the Sin of Solace and the Moonlight Shard. The world lurched once again, and the deafening roar of water reached his ear. What is going on? Assessing his surroundings through shadow sense, Sunny did not notice immediate danger. He did, however, notice Nephis. She had climbed out of the fissure and was now standing on its edge, her white tunic and silver hair fluttering in the wind. Sunny could not see her face, but judging by the lack of weapons in her hands, the situation was not critical. He let out a relieved sigh, then glanced at the destroyed sleeping bag with regret. Just a moment later, the dark island shuddered again, and a strange tremor ran through the black turtle's stone shell. At that moment, an obnoxious voice resounded from his left. "Good morning. Rise and shine." Throwing a contemptuous glance at the spirit of the Sin of Solace, Sunny grimaced and pushed himself off the ground. Soaring high into the air, he kicked the slope of the fissure and propelled himself even higher, landing noiselessly near Nephis a moment later. The 7 suns were already rising, and the world was suffused with the golden radiance of dawn. What is happening? Instead of answering, she pointed her finger at a particular spot off the edge of the island. There, the water was turbulent and foamy, rising in violent waves. The river had washed away most of the blood during the night, but now it was painted red once again. In fact, the red color was more vivid and intense than ever. Sunny frowned. The next moment, something large and swift moved beneath the surface of the red water, and the carcass of the black turtle quaked again. What the? As more blood poured into the great river, there was a strange sound. Soon the azure serpent's giant head rose from the turbulent water and stared at them with its vicious, cloudy eyes. Streams of red were flowing from its impenetrable scales. This time, however, there was something different about the great beast. Clenched tightly in its harrowing jaws was a huge chunk of red, bleeding meat. Still staring at them with malice, the creature moved its jaw and started chewing it. Needless to say, the sight was more than a little disturbing. Standing by Sunny's side, Nephis said, "It's eating the turtle." He glanced at her with a strange expression. "Yeah, I've noticed." With that, both of them fell silent as they watched the serpent, who was watching them while devouring the meat of the slain great monster. Yesterday, Sunny had struggled with chewing through the tough meat of the black turtle, but it was almost melting in the abomination's enormous maw. The jade fangs were painted red as they effortlessly sliced through the bleeding chunk, which was diminishing at an alarming rate. He couldn't help but shudder when imagining what these fangs would do to his own flesh. No armor memory he possessed, and no attribute augmenting his body, stood a chance of resisting the fangs of the great beast, even for a split second. If those jaws closed on Sunny, he would be obliterated in an instant. Sunny stared at the feasting serpent. Then, suddenly, a long sigh escaped from his lips. "You know what? I'm really damn tired of this." Nephis looked at him with a silent question. "Tired of what?" Sunny vaguely pointed with his hand. "It's just, nothing ever goes as it is supposed to, does it? I remember surrendering myself to the cops when I became infected. They told me this and that about how the process of awakening is supposed to happen, and, I swear to the dead gods, not a single thing they told me to expect ended up coming true." A darkly exasperated expression appeared on his face. "My first nightmare, an awakened tyrant appears. The solstice, there's a fallen terror blocking the only way out. The second nightmare, here is a couple of immortal saints I need to kill. Oh, and they are completely out of their minds. Really, I went through so many absolutely unreasonable things as an aspirant, sleeper, and awakened." Sunny rolled his eyes. "I am a master now, and instead of fighting fallen nightmare creatures like masters are supposed to do, there's this great beast staring me down. Let's not even mention all the corrupted abominations I've already killed. Is this what they call suffering from success? If so, I really don't want to be such an overachiever anymore. Can't something normal happen for once?" Listening to him, Nephis tilted her head a little. She remained silent for a bit and then said, "You're right. You really had to overcome completely unreasonable things as an aspirant, sleeper, awakened, and master." Then, a hint of a smile appeared on her lips, and sparks of white light ignited in her eyes. "But, Sunny, considering all that, have you thought about what kind of things you'll have to face as a saint? Sonny's already pale face suddenly became even whiter. A hint of horror appeared in his eyes. Oh gods, he shivered. You evil. No, no, I don't want to even think about it. Smiling, Nephis looked away and concentrated on the azure serpent once again. After a few moments of silence, she said, maybe you should consider this as training then. In any case, what do you think we should do now? Sunny threw a gloomy glance her way and shrugged. I'm not sure. The turtle is huge, so even this old snake won't be able to hollow its shell out quickly. I don't think it can overturn the carcass or break through the carapace at this point, but I'm not sure. We should be ready for anything, I guess. Nephis lingered for a while and then nodded. I agree. Let's wait and see then. As the enormous carcass of the great monster shuddered once again, they stood side by side and watched silently as the water was slowly saturated with crimson blood. Chapter 12:52 Voyage. At first, Sunny and Nephis were tense and fully focused, observing the feasting serpent with grim apprehension and a bit of dread. But then, slowly, it got a little boring. Even though very few people had ever gotten a chance to see a great beast devour a great monster, or maybe none at all, as it turned out, even such a macabre and awesome spectacle could grow old really fast. The black turtle was just too enormous. Even though the azure serpent was gigantic itself, it still couldn't devour a significant portion of its carcass in a short amount of time, no matter how hard it tried. It would probably take the creature days, or even weeks, to put a dent in the floating corpse of the titanic monster. Eventually, Sunny and Nephis found themselves sitting side by side on the green moss, looking silently at the great river. The two of them made for a striking contrast. Sunny was wearing a tunic of black silk embroidered with silver thread, his hair black as a raven's wing. Nephis was wearing a tunic too, hers perfectly white and decorated with red accents. Her long silver hair was moving slightly in the wind. One's eyes were like two pools of unfathomable darkness. The others were gray, calm, and hid within them a boundless, immolating heat. Both would have seemed too flawless and beautiful to a mundane human, with perfectly smooth alabaster skin and faces that seemed to have been chiseled from precious stone by a divine sculptor. Surrounded by the vast expanse of a mystical river and sitting calmly atop the shell of a great monster, wearing no armor and holding no weapons in their hands, they looked like two transient deities that had descended from the heavenly realm to rest on the soft moss and enjoy the breathtaking beauty of this strange world. Of course, Sunny had none of these thoughts. Instead, he had an entirely different view of the current situation. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to being in the company of armor-clad awakened, heavily armed soldiers and military vehicles. Looking at the slender silhouette of Neph's body outlined by the light fabric of her tunic and the weightless silk of his own graceless dusk, he couldn't help but feel a sense of strange incongruity. They were currently in the most dire predicament of their habitually dire lives, and yet, what the hell? We look like we're enjoying a luxury cruise. Of course, leisure cruises and getaways on tropical islands had not been a thing since before the dark times. Sunny just found the idea amusing after randomly learning about that ancient tradition from Rain, and was reminded of that conversation right now. He knew that being surrounded by great abominations was not exactly one's idea of a relaxing vacation. However, the corpse of the black turtle was technically floating, so it was like a ship. At the same time, it was large enough to be an island. The food was delicious, the view was to die for. The company was very nice too. If not for the blooded snout of the azure serpent rising above the water from time to time, he would have actually been quite content. Huh? Sensing his strange mood, Nephis looked at him and raised an eyebrow. You have that funny look in your eyes. Sunny coughed. I was just thinking that this entire situation is weirdly peaceful. We are on top of a dead great monster, and there is great beast slowly devouring that monster as it waits for a chance to munch on our souls, and yet there's nothing to do? He scratched his head. Let me tell you, the start of my second nightmare was nowhere near as relaxing. Plus, this black turtle, it's kind of like a ship, isn't it? So, we're relaxing on a ship. I just think it's funny. Nephis blinked a couple of times, then stared at the black expanse of the black turtle's shell. After a short pause, she said awkwardly, "Oh, you would know better. I actually was never on a real ship." Sunny tilted his head a little. "Oh, that's right. She was brought to Antarctica by Whispering Blade. She never sailed across the ocean on an alloy battleship, only flew through the sky aboard the chain breaker." He chuckled. "Well, it's not that special. Mostly you just stay inside and pray that the ship doesn't start splitting around you, or that something from the outside doesn't come inside to pay you a visit. By the way, Both of those things happened to me. So no matter how strange it feels to say, this feels much nicer. Nephis hesitated for a few moments, then looked away. Her voice was, even when she said, "This is much nicer than the start of my second nightmare too, because I'm not alone." Sunny looked at her carefully. A strange thought surfaced in his mind. Was she going to say something else? He suddenly felt tense again. A lot of very complicated emotions that Sunny had done his best to avoid for a long time reared their heads in his heart. Was she? Luckily, or unfortunately, the azure serpent chose that exact moment to let out a frenzied roar and dive back into the water, sending a huge fountain of it flying into the sky. It seemed that the old snake had been satiated, for now. Full of renewed vigor, the serpent started circling the black turtle once again, raising its head from time to stare at them with deranged eyes. Sunny sighed. This snake just never gives up, does it? Nephis silently nodded and then stood up. Illuminated by the light of the 7 suns and outlined against the blue sky, her lithe figure was like a painting. But it really can't overturn the carcass or break the shell. We don't need to keep watching it for now. Sunny raised an eyebrow. So then, what should we do? She thought for a while, then glanced at the soft carpet of green moss and the mysterious landscape of the dark island. Eventually, Nephis shrugged. Whatever we want? Chapter 12:53, Parade of Shadows. After resting for a while, Sunny and Nephis separated. She went off to study the memories Sir Gilead had transferred to her. There had not been a lot of time to get a proper feel for them in the nightmare desert. Sunny, meanwhile, remained sitting on the soft moss with a contemplative expression. What to do? First, he closed his eyes and sent the 5 shadows to investigate the dark island. It was somewhere between 1 and 2 kilometers across, so there was not a lot of ground to cover. However, the terrain of the giant shell of black rock was weathered and uneven. There were plenty of cracks and fissures, some of them large and easy to notice, others hidden from view. Some were entirely filled with water. The exploration did not take too long. His shadows did not find anything really interesting either. There was the weathered rock, the vibrant patches of green moss, and the remains of the creature's battle armor, its silver now tarnished and bleak. Other than that, the dark island was desolate and barren. What made a deep impression on Sunny, though, were the fissures themselves. At first, he had assumed that they were just natural features of the great monster's stone shell, but after some time, with a shiver, he realized that they were not. Instead, each of the deep grooves was a scar left on the titanic shell of the ancient creature by unknown enemies. None managed to penetrate it, and some were rather shallow. However, some were dark and frighteningly deep. Considering that even the azure serpent was not able to crack the black turtle's carapace, Sunny dreaded to imagine what kind of creatures had left those claw marks on its back. He looked at the gleaming expanse of the great river with gloom. Suddenly, the enchanting beauty of this dreamlike world seemed like a facade that hid unspeakable horrors behind its alluring veil. Of course, Sunny had known that already, but in that moment he felt it stronger than ever before. Beautiful things are the most dangerous. Glancing in the direction where Nephis had left, he sighed and stretched his legs. The shadows returned, and then 3 figures rose from them. Onyx Saint, Nightmare, and Ravenous Fiend. He silently studied them for a while, thinking. Saint was stoic and indifferent, as always. If he did not know that she was alive, he would have assumed that the graceful and towering figure in front of him was a beautiful statue. Nightmare was staring at the azure serpent, which was circling the island, with dark and malevolent fury burning in his crimson eyes. Imp seemed a little uncomfortable under Sunny's gaze, shifting from foot to foot nervously. Nightmare was the weakest of the 3, but also offered the most utility to Sunny. He didn't necessarily need to use the Tenebrous Stallion as a battle companion. That said, his steed was very close to unlocking the Terror ability and finally realizing its full potential. The next rank was also not far away. Once Nightmare came into his power as a terror and ascended, his power would take a great leap. Sunny had little means of speeding up that process at the moment, though. It was going to happen when it happened, probably before too long. Saint, meanwhile, was already incredibly powerful. She was so powerful, in fact, that Sunny had no means of pushing her to greater power anymore. To make the graceful stone knight achieve the supreme rank, he would need 300 transcended memories of the first tier, or 600 ascended ones, or 1,200 awakened ones. Needless to say, these numbers were unattainable at the moment. He didn't even want to count the potential number of dormant memories she would need to rank up. Reaching a higher class, meanwhile, required luck and stumbling on a uniquely suitable enemy. It was outside his control. Saint had already classed up twice, but the rest of his shadows, excluding the aberrant soul serpent, had yet to do it even once. That went to show how rare such opportunities were. There was one thing Sonny could do right now, though. Glancing at Saint, he sent Morgan's warbow and the stifled scream her way. The bow was self-explanatory. He was planning to make Saint the sentry for as long as they remained on the dark island. The stifled scream, however, was more tricky. That charm of his had an enchantment called. Its description read, when wearing this charm, the physical power of its master is augmented, but only as long as they remain silent. The longer their silence lasts, uninterrupted, the greater the boon of power they'll receive. This was a powerful enchantment indeed, and one perfectly suited for the taciturn shadow. However, he had never managed to get a lot out of it, because there had never been an opportunity to keep Saint summoned for weeks on end. Right now, however, there was an interesting idea in Sonny's head. The physical augmentation, the stifled scream, grows stronger the longer one stays silent. So, it functions in relation to time. Weren't they flowing through time, though? Sonny did not know how exactly the distance traveled on the Great River corresponded to time, but he assumed that it was not a small amount. Were they moving one day into the past each day, 1 month, 1 year? If so, then the augmentation of the stifled scream could potentially reach its theoretical limit in no time. That was an outlandish theory, but it was worth checking out at least. Satisfied, Sonny turned to Imp. On paper, the scrawny goblin was on the same level of power as Saint. He was a transcendent devil as well. But in reality, there was an insurmountable gap between them. Imp was just an adolescent as far as shadows went, after all. He was still on the weaker side, inexperienced and untrained. His core physical attribute, the just recently evolved to the gist more. Sonny had thought that it would be extremely hard to locate large quantities of metal of higher quality than the body of Sun Prince. But, as it turned out, he was wrong. They were currently on top of the Black Turtle's titanic corpse, and that corpse was encased in the remains of similarly titanic battle armor. Surely, the armor deserving of a great monster would be made of some truly incredible stuff. Looking at the nervous Imp, Sonny grinned and pointed to the nearest jagged chunk of tarnished silver. "Go, buddy. Gorge yourself. Bon appetit." The scrawny goblin tentatively turned to look in the direction he was pointing. A few moments later, its eyes dramatically widened. "I bet it's going to be a bit tough to chew, buh?" Before Sonny could finish speaking, Imp was already dashing toward the band of ancient silver with a maddened expression. He chuckled. "I guess it smells delicious." Chapter 1254, Back to Basics. With Saint standing guard, Nightmare keeping her company, and Imp happily munching on the tarnished silver of the great monster's battle armor, Sonny was once again left with nothing much to do. The 7 suns were shining in the 3-colored sky. The clear waters of the great river were flowing as they sparkled in the sunlight. The azure serpent was hungrily circling the dark island, ramming it from time to time to make its wrathful madness known. The sin of solace was brooding silently. A gentle breeze was playing with Sonny's hair. With a sigh, he swept it back and rose, planning to go find Nephis. This is too weird. He had expected many situations to arise at the start of the 3rd nightmare, but one thing he had not expected was being left with nothing urgent to do. Walking across the weathered surface of the black rock, Sonny went around a torn band of dull silver, traversed a few patches of moss, and finally laid his eye on Nephis. She was training. Holding an unfamiliar longsword, Nephis was practicing a complicated chain of moves, her silver hair dancing in the air. There were beads of sweat on her face, and the hem of the airy tunic was flaring, revealing smooth porcelain skin. Her movements were limber and flowing, gracefully cascading into each other. The sight of it was beautiful. Neph's swordsmanship was beautiful, and she was beautiful too, illuminated by the dreamlike radiance of the 7 suns and dancing with a silvery sword on a carpet of green moss. With her white tunic and alabaster skin, she was like a fairy. Sonny found himself standing motionlessly in the shadow of a rock outcropping, watching. He had been planning to call out to Nephis, but now, forgetting about it, he silently remained where he was. Some time passed. Sonny wasn't sure how much exactly. The island trembled once more. Eventually, he shifted slightly, as though escaping a reverie, and took a step forward to escape the shadows. "Hey." Nephis stopped and leaned on her sword, breathing heavily. Her chest was rising and falling, and her face was slightly flushed. Walking over, Sonny summoned the endless spring and offered it to her with a friendly smile. Accepting the beautiful glass bottle, she sat down and wiped the sweat off her face, then threw her head back and drank greedily. Sonny glanced at her slender neck and the beads of sweat glistening above the collar of her tunic, which was slightly damp and sticking a little to her body. Then he looked away. Thank you. After drinking her fill, Nephis returned the endless spring to Sunny. He hesitated for a moment, then drank some of the cool, refreshing water himself and sat down near her. He had completely forgotten what he was going to say. After a moment or two of peaceful silence, Sunny finally remembered. I've been thinking, currently the most powerful combatant among us is the Onyx Saint, my shadow. You must know that she is a transcendent devil now. Should something happen, she would be our best bet against the old snake. We should try augmenting her with both of our aspects and test just how strong she would become. They already knew that Nephis was able to share her flames with his shadows, but the last time they had attempted it was a lifetime ago, in the basement of his home in NQSC. Saint had been a mere ascended demon back then, while Sunny had been an early-stage devil. Now, she was a transcendent devil, and he was a tyrant. And Nephis was a terror. She had absorbed a great number of soul shards during the Battle of the Black Skull, and gained the last few in the Nightmare Desert. The situation back then had been too desperate and frenetic to think about it, and honestly, Sunny didn't really care about competing with her anymore. All their powers had risen. Perhaps, with the help of shadows and soul flame, Saint would be able to scratch against the level of strength of a supreme creature. Of course, there was a big problem. As a being whose flesh was akin to stone, she could not swim and would immediately sink if pushed into the great river. Still, it was worth testing. Nephis nodded. Yes, that sounds like a good idea. She leaned back a little and closed her eyes, enjoying the cool caress of the breeze with a faint smile. Sunny watched her silently for a few moments. Eventually he said, "Your swordsmanship has changed." Neph's favored style was always flowing and unpredictable, but now it had assumed a strange, almost mystical quality. Sunny had been a complete novice when they first met. His skill now was incomparable with that of 4 years ago. He had grown with an explosive, truly astonishing speed. But Nephis had grown too. Perhaps her progress was not quite as stunningly rapid. She did not have the benefit of having an aspect legacy to fuel it, after all. But, compared to even the most talented humans, it was still tremendously swift. Sunny and Nephis had sparred a lot after she returned from the second nightmare, but she had been held back by her nascent essence control back then. Now, she had fully come into her power as a master, and was able to push her skill to entirely new limits, maybe even past them. Opening her eyes, Nephis smiled. I guess it did. Then, she leaned forward and looked into the distance with a contemplative expression. For me, my understanding of swordsmanship went through a transformation after the ascension. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Sounds serious. She nodded with a distant look. Yes, it was because of learning to control my essence. Awakened possess a rudimentary form of essence control. They broadly enhance their entire bodies with essence, sometimes narrowing the scope down to a particular limb. After learning to do it as easily as breathing, they can become masters, and naturally transition to a much more targeted, intricate, and efficient manner of using essence. Her eyes glinted. But I've never been an awakened. I went straight to being a master. So, learning to control essence was very hard for me. I had to be conscious of every muscle in my body, every tendon and every bone. It was like learning to walk again. A corner of Sunny's mouth twitched as he suppressed a smile. He vividly remembered helping her pass these exact obstacles. Nephis, meanwhile, continued. So, I had to go back to basics. Which groups of muscles do I need to enhance to perform the cut in the most efficient and effective way? My hand, my shoulder, my back, my core, my thighs, my calves. Everything had to work in harmony to produce the best result. It took a while to become proficient enough in controlling essence to do it right without thinking, and, in the process, I became much more aware of my body. I also got submerged in studying the basics, on a much deeper level than before, going deeper and deeper. Sunny looked at her with curiosity. How deep are we talking about? She smiled, lingered for a moment, and then said, Force equals mass times acceleration. He blinked. What? What? Sunny had not expected to hear a physics formula, and he only knew that this was a physics formula because teacher Julius had once thrown a tantrum about his lack of education and forced him to read a bunch of children's school books. Nephis smiled. That is the basis of swordsmanship, or spearmanship, or any other kind of weapon skill. Fundamentally, it's all about delivering force. The amount of force is dependent on mass and acceleration. Your body is the source of that force, and your weapon is a force multiplier. It concentrates it into a narrow tip, thus making it easier to deliver lethal damage. She pointed to the sharp tip of her sword. Of course, there are more nuances to that. For example, speed does not exist in a vacuum. It is relative to the enemy. Your body also has to borrow from the ground you are standing on. There is balance, centers of gravity, reaction speed. As for the sword itself, there is flexibility, material composition, center of percussion, and so on. There is also soul essence, memory enchantments, attributes, and aspect abilities to consider. Sunny was looking at her incredulously, which caused Nephis to shrug in embarrassment. Well, anyway, I've been studying the fundamentals, physics, anatomy, spell studies, and a bit of other stuff, a lot since returning from the second nightmare, and slowly incorporating these insights into my swordsmanship. Something like that. He tilted his head, a bit dumbfounded. That can't be right. How have we gone from the essence of combat is murder to force equals mass times acceleration? So, Nephis had been studying science to shore up her fundamentals and evolve her swordsmanship? That sounded very strange, but the result was apparent. She had clearly improved by leaps and bounds since her ascension. Sunny shook his head in disbelief and then threw a pointed look at her. His voice was incredulous. Care for a spar? Chapter 12, 55 Dancing Spirits. With a faint smile on her face, Nephis nodded and raised her sword, pointing it at him in invitation. Sunny summoned the Sin of Solace and took a stance opposite her. From the forgotten shore to the basement of his home in the peaceful terrace district, they had trained with each other numerous times. This simple sequence of actions was as natural for them as breathing. However, today, there was an awkward pause. Sunny scratched the back of his head and glanced at the jade gene. That isn't going to work, is it? Nephis seemed to have come to a similar conclusion, looking at him sheepishly. No, what the hell? Since when does she know how to emote? This is just too cute. He coughed. The problem facing them was that both had grown too powerful, and, subsequently, the weapons they used were too powerful, too. The Sin of Solace was a transcendent memory of the 5th tier, and quite a harrowing one at that. Sunny was not entirely sure what the level of Neff's longsword was, but it had to be quite a menacing weapon as well, considering that it had come from the soul arsenal of a saint. It would be already bad enough if the Sin of Solace damaged or destroyed it, but what if Sunny was not careful enough and scratched Nephis in the process? The curse of madness carried by the jade blade would either crush her mental defenses or at least put debilitating pressure on her mind for a period of time. Standing some distance away, the spirit of the gene smiled. No, don't worry, I'll be gentle. However, that smile of his was more than a little bit sinister. Sunny frowned, then dismissed the jade sword and got lost in thought for a few moments. Eventually, a smile of delight appeared on his lips. Let's do this. The shadows around them suddenly moved and flowed toward him, then slowly formed into 2 inky black swords. One of them was a fearsome odachi, while the other was an elegant longsword. The odachi was easy to create. This was one of the shapes Sunny had practiced relentlessly, after all. The longsword was a little bit tricky, since he had never created one before. Nevertheless, he was familiar with it as well, and so managed to produce a passable one with some effort. One would think that manifesting shadows into a weapon would be easier than shaping them into articulated hands, since weapons were static by nature. However, in reality, shaping a sword was just as complex of a task. A good sword had to possess certain characteristics to feel right in the hand: weight, balance, flexibility, and rigidity, center of percussion that Neff had recently mentioned, and so on. It was especially daunting with something like the Adachi, which possessed a rigid edge and a flexible spine. To improve in that regard, Sunny had even studied a bit of blacksmithing on the network. Back then, clan valor had been preventing him from visiting the dream realm, so he had a lot of free time. There were many levels to shadow manifestation, and shaping was only the most basic of them. Sunny could also affect the material composition of the manifested shadows, although that demanded a higher essence expenditure. He could manipulate the density of the shadows, for example. He could make them feel like steel or porous limestone. With some effort, he could even make them slippery or adhesive. In the past, all these internal transformations had been very difficult to achieve, but after inventing shadow incarnation, Sunny made a breakthrough in his mastery of shadow manifestation as well. Now, it was much easier, all that was to say. When Nephis dismissed her longsword and curiously took the shadow weapon from his hand, he secretly held his breath. She weighed the black longsword, then swung it a few times to test how it felt. Then, she nodded in satisfaction. That works. Sunny suppressed a proud smile and raised his odachi. Let's begin then. That feeling. He missed it. The Sin of Solace was a piece of art in the form of a gene, but Sunny's heart still lay with blades like this one. Maybe because it was what he had learned swordsmanship with, wielding Midnight Shard on the Forgotten Shore. not to mention all the fun times he had had as mongrel in the dreamscape. Raising the odachi slightly, Sunny pushed himself forward and attacked. The two of them were instantly entangled in a breathtaking dance of singing steel. Their swift figures blurred, and soon nothing but a dark shape and a light shape could be seen, moving across the green moss as they weaved and circled around each other. It was as though two spirits were dancing under the bright light of the radiant suns. She really has improved. Neff's swordsmanship felt different. It had always been somewhat ineffable due to her eerie ability to control both the battlefield and the enemy, but now there was an even more bizarre quality to her graceful skill. The steps seemed the same. The cadence seemed the same. The offensive and defensive moves seemed the same as well. However, these familiar elements were somehow entirely different and incredibly more dangerous. Her light steps never failed to deliver her into the best possible position to attack. Each strike packed a devastating punch that seemed too extreme even for an ascended terror. Her defense was nearly impenetrable, alternating between immovable hardness and inviting softness, which dissipated the force of Sunny's attacks and made him feel as though he was drowning in a bog. No, he was drowning in her flowing sword. How is she so different? It was not as though Sunny did not understand the same principles Neff had spoken about. The relationship between mass, acceleration, and force. He was intimately familiar with it as well. After all, Sunny had long incorporated the ability to change his weight at will into his battle skill, so much so that it had become second nature to him. By manipulating how much his body, or various parts of it, weighed on the fly, he was able to enhance the force of his attacks, secure his balance, and even perform seemingly impossible moves by shifting his center of gravity. By now, it was like an instinct. He knew a lot about anatomy too, both from his own training after the ascension, mastery of shadow dance, and learning how to create shadow hands. Everything that Nephis had mentioned, Sunny studied too. However, as they fought, he understood the difference between them. It was the difference between an intuitive, instinctual knowledge and a comprehensive, systemic understanding. And so, even though Sunny could perceive the essence of what Nephis was doing through shadow dance, he couldn't repeat it with the same level of insight. This was different from fighting Morgan. Morgan was supremely skilled, yes, but the main challenge of dueling her was the dire power of her enchanted body and her sharp, killing will. Nephis was not using any augmentations, and her will was vast and calm as an ocean. Beneath that indomitable calmness hid the fiery fury of a roaring flame. It was pure technique, pure insight, pure mastery, pure passion. Sunny frowned, feeling that he too was starting to sweat. Nephis was strong, but he was strong too. Among human swordsmen, he was perhaps one of the strongest. His mind was clear. His elusive skill was perilously insidious. He was not the same person he had been before. Antarctica had forged him into someone much more steady, powerful, and deadly. Their duel was exhilarating. Chapter 1256, Reaching for the Stars. Sunny and Nephis climbed back into the familiar fissure only after the seven suns plunged into the waters of the great river. They hungrily consumed the last few ration packs from the covetous coffer, and then settled on the weathered rock to sleep. Saint was standing guard above the fissure, and Nightmare was near to protect their dreams. So, they decided not to alternate and let themselves rest through the whole night. The world was swiftly enveloped in darkness. The nocturnal glow of the great river did not reach the depths of the fissure, and there were no stars or the moon in the sky. The world was entirely black, as if they had plunged into an endless void. Listening to the soft sounds of Neff's breath, Sunny let the sense of fatigue overwhelm him. He was tired. However, it was not the cruel, chilling exhaustion he had suffered often in the past months. Instead, this fatigue was of a satisfying and pleasurable kind, something he had not felt in a while. Sunny had learned a lot during their training today. They had practiced together until the sun set, and in the process, both had done their best to make the opponent sweat. He had not held back much, and neither had Nephis. In the end, Sunny found himself lacking. Even after all this time, she was still like a distant star, one he could see but never touch, at least in terms of swordsmanship and mastery of battle. It should have been disheartening, but he found it strangely encouraging instead. Sunny felt as though he had been shown a new horizon, something to strive for, as well as a clear direction to reach for the stars. He also realized that there were still flaws in his mastery of shadow dance. That was a valuable revelation in and of itself. Armed with it, he could refine and perfect his formless style, bringing it closer to the next step. That said, Sunny felt very strange right now. It was because he had realized that, currently, he was more powerful than Nephis. Yes, she was a better fighter than him. However, Sunny had so many tools at his disposal. He also had 2 transcendent devils and an awakened terror on his side. If the 2 of them were to battle seriously, he wasn't entirely sure who would be left standing at the end, but he knew that his odds were much higher than hers. It was a vast, tumultuous, and deeply unsettling emotion. What surprised him the most, however, was how weak of a reaction it aroused in him. There had been a time when becoming more powerful than Nephis was all he ever thought about, but now, he felt almost indifferent. It was what it was. There was no point in racing to the finish line anyway. That line would not change. It did not matter which one of them became a terror first, because sooner or later, both of them would end up as titans. It did not matter that Sunny was ahead for the first time. Her ascended ability was not of a kind that added to one's power, that was all. They were in the same boat anyway. Perhaps he could allow himself to feel that way because he was more secure about the shadow bond and the power she held over him. Nephis had proven that she had no intention of ever using it, and he had grown more confident in his ability to make one or both of them die, even if she did. How romantic, he sighed, feeling calm and cozy in the darkness that enveloped them. After a while, Sunny asked, "Hey, Neph, are you asleep yet?" There were few moments of silence before she answered. "No." Hidden in the darkness, he grinned. "How is the sleeping bag? Is it warm?" There had been only 2 sleeping bags in the covetous coffer, one that Sunny used in the wilderness, and a spare one. Sadly, he had ripped through one of them when the azure serpent first made the dark island quake, so now there was only one. Sunny had chosen to sleep on the weathered rock, relying on the unique qualities of the marble shell to keep him comfortable. Luckily, the great river seemed to have a mild climate, so he was not particularly cold. The fissure protected them from the wind, as well. So, he had no problem letting Nephis use the only remaining sleeping bag. However, that didn't mean that he wouldn't tease her about it. A calm answer came from the darkness. "Yes, I am warm. It is of high quality." As the grin froze on Sunny's face, he sighed. "She's really too thick to be teased. Damn." A few moments later, Neph asked, "Oh, do you want me to hand it over? It is your sleeping bag. It would only be right for the owner to use it." Sunny flinched. "No, no, keep it. That's not what I wanted at all. Gods, she's hopeless." There was a long pause. Then, Neph's voice came from the darkness again. "Ah, I see. You want to use it together?" Hearing that, Sunny's entire body shuddered. "What? No, that's not what I meant at all. Who do you take me for? I was just teasing you." Suddenly, he heard a soft chuckle. Turning his head, Sunny saw Neph covering her mouth with a hand. She was suppressing a laugh. His eyes widened. "Wait, a reverse tease? I've been played." His heart ached. How embarrassing. He stared at Nephis incredulously for a few moments, then laid down and looked back at the jagged line of the distant black sky. A moment or two later, he suddenly laughed, too. This is just too ridiculous." Nephis lowered her hand, then asked in an amused tone, "What is?" Sunny shrugged. "I mean, we are sailing a river of an unholy titan's blood on the corpse of a great monster, moving back in time, and giggling like children." She remained silent for a while before saying in her usual calm tone, "Yes, it does sound a little ridiculous." Then, there was a comfortable silence between them. Sunny looked at the black sky for a while. Soon, a sigh escaped from his lips. He lingered for a long time, then turned his head to look at her again. "Neph, can I ask you something?" She turned her head to face him as well, even though she couldn't see anything in the dark. "Sure." Sunny hesitated, but eventually he still asked, "Can you tell me what happened to you in the second nightmare?" A hint of amusement slowly disappeared from her eyes. Her faint smile was erased as well. Nephis remained silent for a long time, her expression turning bleak and distant. Then she sighed. "Okay, I'll tell you." Her voice sounded strangely forlorn. Turning away, Nephis looked into the darkness and said, "In my second nightmare, I was a woman made of stone, like your shadow, but also different, defective." Chapter 12, 57, In the Darkness. Nephis looked into the darkness as she spoke in an even voice. "It happened after the demon of destiny had his falling out with the goddess of the black skies, I think. But before hope escaped her chains, and the demons rose in rebellion against the gods, in the darkness, in the true darkness that fills the halls and caverns of the underworld." below the hollow mountains. She sighed. When I opened my eyes, I was a woman made of stone, a crude, clumsy, and defective precursor of the stone saints. I was laying on a mountain of abandoned statues just like me, all of them broken, discarded, and forsaken. Everything around me was enveloped by cold darkness, with not a spark of light or hint of warmth anywhere. There was just me, my broken siblings, and the lonesome silence. Sunny shifted slightly. True darkness? Nephis slowly nodded. Yes, those mountains are called hollow, but in fact they are full of darkness. Their hollows are like great reservoirs of it. It is where darkness lives, and where it comes from. True darkness is very much like this river, in fact. Legends say that a terrible creature was slain by the gods once, at the dawn of time, and that its blood seeped into the earth. This is what true darkness is, the dark creature's blood. Sunny shivered. That dark creature, to be the source of all true darkness, of the entire element of darkness. It had to be something far greater than an unholy titan. It must have been one of the unknown, then. A being of the void. Ignorant of what he was thinking about, Nephis continued after a short pause. The hollow mountains are a scar left by the death of that creature, and so, most of true darkness remains below them. This is the place that Nether made his home. However, it was not entirely empty. While he ruled the underworld, there were many others living in the darkness. She lingered for a moment. There were some who followed Nether, the remains of the army he had led to wage war on Storm God. They lived in the great hollows within the peaks. There were also his children, the stone saints, who lived below the mountains in the heart of the underworld. And there were also creatures who lived even lower, near the very bottom of the dark abyss. That is where the pile of discarded statues was. Sunny frowned. Wait, Nether waged war on Storm God? On his own? Before the rebellion? A pale smile appeared on Neff's face. Yes, it was his own private affair. I don't know the details of his relationship with Storm God, or why it ended in resentment, but he must have taken it to heart, enough so that he assembled an army and stormed the divine realm. Of course, he lost. Most of his army was decimated, and he secluded himself in the underworld, becoming its ruler and losing himself in the obsession of trying to create the stone saints. She paused for a moment. He must have been lonely and heartbroken, to create a whole race of living beings just to keep him company. Or maybe it was his defiant, prideful way of challenging the gods. After all, only the gods could create living things. Despite that, somehow Nether succeeded. But he failed many times before achieving success. Nephis grew silent for a moment, and then said, I was one of these failures. A quiet sigh escaped from her lips. There were many creatures in the darkness at the roots of the underworld, all of them abandoned and discarded, just like me. Some of them were the results of Nether's failed attempts to create the stone saints. Some of them were outcasts and derelicts for whom there was no place in the world above anymore. All of them were pitiful and weak, and I was the weakest of them all. Nephis stared silently into the darkness for a while. The expression on her face was sad and remorseful. Eventually, she spoke softly. I was just a sleeper, after all. Even with the echo I gained in the nightmare desert, out there in the darkness, my strength was pitiful. Ah, it was such a blow. I never realized how much pride I took in being strong before that nightmare. I had always relied on my strength. I had always told myself that I had to be strong. If only I was strong like my father. If only I was strong, stronger, the strongest. Then I wouldn't break apart, and the people around me wouldn't need to suffer on my behalf, either. Sunny remained silent, remembering Neff's nightmare that he had visited after she returned to the waking world. He also thought about his own desperate pursuit of strength. Nephis smiled. But in the nightmare, all my strength was worthless. All my pride was worthless too. All I had was weakness. And so, I had to learn that personal power was not something I should rely on, or could rely on. It had always seemed so important, but in the end, it turned out to be a deceitful mirage. A slight frown appeared on her face. You see, there were not only the outcasts and discarded creatures like me in the darkness at the roots of the underworld, there were other things as well, terrifying things that were born from the darkness. These things hunted us. There were ancient horrors dwelling in the very depths of the abyss as well. Sometimes they would crawl from below to devour us. No one in the underworld cared about what happened to us, if they even remembered our existence. The aloof demon of destiny, the first generation of the stone saints, and the remains of the demon's soldiers, none would protect us. The Forsaken had to fend for themselves. But we were weak and pitiful, and, most of all, we were divided. Her voice shook a little. Sunny lingered for a few moments, then asked carefully, So, what did you do? How did you survive? Nephis took a deep breath. I had to accept my weakness and learn how to survive despite being weak. The lesson was harsh, demeaning, and painful, but I had no choice but to learn it. So, I coaxed, persuaded, deceived, enticed, and cajoled the other forsaken creatures living in the darkness. But, most of all, I inspired them. You see, I realized that there was something much sharper than my wit, much more persuasive than my words, and much more compelling than my lies. She paused for a moment. That something was desire. Chapter 12:58, Last Light. Hidden in the darkness, Sunny flinched. The image of the piece of wet wood littered with demented runes suddenly appeared in his mind, as did the word repeating in the runes over and over again. Wish, desire. Be careful of what you wish for. Be careful what you desire. He frowned while Nephis continued somberly. All I had to do was instill a desire in the Forsaken, a desire for a better life, longer life, safer life, a yearning for things that they had either never known or long forgotten. Comfort, companionship, warmth. I had to give them hope, because we couldn't survive alone, but we could survive together. Most of these creatures were solitary and numb, resigned to their dark existence. The weight of their hopelessness and despair was too great for me to pull them from it. But, by igniting a yearning in their hearts, I could make them push themselves forward with their own strength. She grew silent once again, and remained so for a long time this time. When Nephis spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. We gathered together and built a village. It had tall walls and stone houses. It even had a large hall for us to gather and enjoy each other's company. And, for a while, life was good. United, we could protect ourselves from the creatures of darkness and hide from the abyssal visitors behind the tall walls. I thought that I was on the right track. There were old creatures in the village that taught me their knowledge and wisdom. There were those who had been warriors once. I learned from them as well. I was the weakest one, but I was liked and valued, because I could create light, which all of them had forgotten. White sparks ignited in her eyes before trembling and disappearing. Neff's face grew motionless, but then someone in the village vanished, and then someone else. At first I thought that they had left, but after the third one was gone, the fourth, the fifth, we all realized that something was wrong. They didn't leave, they were taken. After that, every night, what served as night in the underworld, someone would disappear. We were under attack. She paused. We tried everything in our power to find and confront the creature that was killing the villagers. We enhanced our defenses, increased our vigilance, we investigated, we explored the surrounding darkness for clues. We set traps, carved sorcerous runes into the stone, and placed lures. We even sent an envoy to plead for help from the children of Nether. But nothing worked. Neff's voice was growing dull. No help came. Nothing we did managed to stop the disappearances. In fact, it only grew worse. At first, the Forsaken were just vanishing, but later their mutilated corpses started to appear around the village, strewn on stalagmites for us to see. As though the creature was leaving them there to mock us. It was then that I understood that I had not created a safe haven for us, and instead simply set the table for the creature of darkness. Her face was motionless, and her voice was even. However, Sunny could feel how fragile that mask was at the moment. Neff took a deep breath. Eventually, everything collapsed. Those who were still alive cursed me and abandoned the village. Tried to. They didn't make it far. There were only 2 of us left inside the empty walls, myself and another one of the broken statues. The first one who had become my companion, and followed me almost from the very start. We locked ourselves inside the village hall, not knowing what else to do, and barricaded the doors. However, the creature still came. I didn't see it enter, but I could feel that the darkness around us was suddenly alive. Sunny looked at her carefully. So, how did you defeat it? Nephis slowly shook her head. I did not. I had thought about giving one last, desperate fight, but as soon as I sensed it, I knew that there was no hope. That thing, it wasn't something I could fight. So I spoke to it. I tried to appease it. I tried to persuade it. I even knelt and begged it. I tried everything I could, and I could feel it watching me, listening to me, surrounding me. For a while, there was silence. In that silence, Nephis shivered and let out a heavy sigh. In the end, the creature took my companion, but spared me. I don't know why. All I know is that the darkness felt empty again, and I was suddenly alone in that darkness. I was the only one left in the village that we had built. Everyone else, all of them, were dead. Her voice trembled a little. That was the end of my nightmare. Sunny sighed and sat up, summoning the endless spring. Nephis had talked for a while, after all. Her throat must have been parched. Approaching her in the darkness, Sunny sat down and used his nail to clink against the glass bottle a couple of times, to let her know where it was. Nephis took the bottle and took a small sip, then looked at the ground. Sunny hesitated for a moment. The appraisal. Do you remember how the spell appraised your performance? Nephis shook her head. I was pretty out of it there at the end. I remember standing in the middle of the empty hall, and the next thing I remember was you calling me by my true name at the academy. Sunny sighed, then leaned forward and lightly patted her on the shoulder. Well, if it means anything, I think you did well. You did really well, Neph. He felt her body tremble slightly and then took the endless spring from her fingers. Thank you for telling me. Now, let's sleep. He lingered for a moment and then added lightly, please be careful with the sleeping bag though. Don't rip it. It's really expensive. She nodded, then smiled faintly and lay down, turning away. Sunny looked at Neff's back for a few moments, then silently returned to his own sleeping spot and sprawled on the weathered rock. He stared at the black sky for a few moments before closing his eyes. Would I have survived that nightmare? Sunny really did not know. He could also tell that Nephis had brushed past many perilous fights and dire torments that she must have endured there, in the darkness, all alone. His heart was heavy, but before too long, the exhaustion won, sending him into the embrace of sleep. Chapter 12:59. Pristine Soul. In the morning, the island shook again. Sunny opened his eyes and reached through the shadow sense, checking in on Saint. Since the taciturn knight was standing calmly above the fissure, he relaxed and yawned with great satisfaction. He felt incredibly refreshed. The dark island was in one piece, and nothing was pouncing to kill them. Life was great. He sat up, leaned on the slope of the fissure, then rubbed his eyes and looked around. Nephis was already up, doing light stretches a few meters away. Sunny watched her for a few moments, then forced himself to avert his gaze. The sound of her even, yet fragile voice resounding from the darkness still echoed in his ears. Neph's second nightmare was different from his own, just like her first nightmare had been. She had not battled immortal saints to free an imprisoned demon from divine chains. Instead, she had tried to save a small group of pitiful and forlorn creatures, only to watch them all die. Nephis had been the last one standing on the forgotten shore, and after traveling alone through the purgatory of the nightmare desert, she built a tiny community amidst the cold darkness, only to watch it be destroyed. She had been so strong, but the nightmare made her weak. She had been so proud, but the nightmare made her beg for mercy on her knees. He wasn't sure he could imagine how painful it was for her to sacrifice the two things that were at the core of her sense of self. Yes, Neph had not slain impossibly powerful enemies with her radiant sword in the nightmare, but, for her, wielding a sword against an overwhelming foe was not something to be feared. Maybe that was why the spell always tried to break her in some other, more cruel way. Sunny looked down at the weathered surface of the black rock. The spell, I wonder, how had the spell appraised Neph's performance in the second nightmare? Sunny was not sure, but he had an inkling that the appraisal was exceedingly high. If his theory was right, that was, and the appraisal depended on how much the challenger had changed the flow of fate. In that regard, he suspected that what Nephis had done was miraculous. She had wanted to change the fates of the forsaken creatures living in the darkness at the bottom of the underworld. In that task, she failed. However, she had succeeded in changing something else. She changed the harrowing creature that had come from the darkness. Had the creature been compelled by her words, by her pleas, or had it been infected by the same yearning that Neph had ignited in the hearts of the forsaken? Had the creature of darkness been poisoned by a hint of an indescribable longing? Had it learned to long for light? If the heart of an abyssal being powerful enough to be a horror in the underworld had been changed, even ever so slightly, then Sunny could not really imagine what ripples that change could cause in the great tapestry of fate. So, the spell could have appraised Neph's performance as glorious, but that was not important, because Nephis herself did not see it that way. The spell and its carriers had different criteria for success, after all. The spell might be satisfied with Neph's performance, but Neph obviously saw it as a bitter, irredeemable failure. The tone of her voice yesterday had said it all. Continuing to stare at the ground, Sunny sighed. After returning to the waking world, Nephis seemed much more mellow than before. But her resolve to kill the sovereigns and destroy the spell also seemed much more stalwart than before. Now that he knew the truth, many things about her past words and actions made sense. Gods, just what am I going to do with her? Sunny glanced at Nephis, who was oblivious to his thoughts, with a complicated expression. There was one more thing he had to consider. The description of Neph's aspect, Lightbringer, Hinsisi Farive. dozens and warmth to wherever you go, but with it comes indescribable longing, man's. Wasn't it very similar to the trial the spell had presented her with in the second nightmare? The ascended ability she had unlocked as a result was called, too, longing, yearning, desire, wish, was the inexhaustible longing to destroy the spell that burned like fire in Nave's heart, so powerful that it made her soul incorruptible. He had pondered about this ability of hers before, but now Sunny saw it in a new light. It had seemed like a rather useless power to have, outside of very rare circumstances like facing the Skinwalker. However, if that ability made Nephis immune to the corruption, then wasn't it actually the most broken and unbelievably preposterous ability he had ever heard about? After all, even Weaver had to sever their arm when it got infected with the corruption. Not only was the great and terrible demon of fate not immune to corruption, he or she was even powerless in front of it. Just what was Nephis, exactly? And, more importantly, what was she to him? The subject of his thoughts, meanwhile, finished her stretching exercises, pulled the fastened strap of her white tunic back to her pale shoulder, and looked around. Nephis smiled. "You're up." Sunny smiled back. "Yeah. How are you feeling?" It seemed as though she had recovered from opening the old wounds to tell him about her second nightmare yesterday. However, a moment later, Neff's smiling face darkened a little. She sighed. "I wanted to make breakfast, but we have no food left." Sunny tilted his head, then looked down. They were literally sitting on a mountain of meat, but with the azure serpent circling the carcass of the black turtle, diving into the river to procure even a little bit of it was an utterly lethal task. He shook his head with resignation. "We'll solve that problem when the time comes." Nephis nodded, lingered for a moment, then pointed to the sleeping bag. "See? I didn't rip it." Sunny stared at her, trying to determine whether she was being serious or playing a joke on him. These days, it was getting hard to tell. "Which bastard is being such a bad influence on my straight-laced and awkward Neph? I'm going to bash their teeth in." He remained silent for a few moments, then grinned. "Good, because, you still owe me for that projector." Chapter 1260 Leisure Cruise. Time flowed lazily, both literally and figuratively. The current of the great river was pulling the corpse of the black turtle into the past, and several days passed in a strange but pleasant idleness. The seven suns rose and fell, drowning in the shimmering waters. The sky was like a dreamlike painting of lilac, azure, crimson, and jet black. The ancient serpent continued to circle the dark island, slowly consuming the bleeding meat of the great monster it had killed, and watching Sunny and Nephis enjoy their unexpected respite. The two of them were spending their time leisurely. Feeling the need to rest and recuperate after the nightmarish gauntlet of the White Desert, they were not in a hurry to strain themselves too much. They slept peacefully through the nights, rising when warm sunlight flowed into the narrow fissure, and spent most of the days together. Sometimes they would lay on the soft moss side by side and look at the sky in comfortable silence. Sometimes they would train, sparring with each other until sweat covered their bodies. Sometimes they would talk, discussing their experiences in the past year and various pieces of knowledge they had picked up along the way. They also spent some time apart. Nephis was busy practicing her swordsmanship, often requesting Saint to aid her as a training partner. After sending her and his shadow off, Sunny would get busy with his own endeavors. He spent a lot of time studying the strange and hauntingly complex weave of the Key of the Estuary. This memory was a great mystery that had to be solved. Even after showing it to Nephis, Sunny had not a single inkling of what it was supposed to do and where it had come from. So, he settled for the slow approach of meticulously examining each and every thread of its somber tapestry. Depending on luck, this task could take him many months to complete, but there was no harm in starting early. Once his head started to ache from studying the black weave, Sunny would sit silently near the slopes of the island and watch the azure serpent prowl. He would close his eyes and sense the great beast's shadow. He would try to memorize its every scale, scar, and movement. Even though their situation was peaceful right now, he knew that the peace would not last indefinitely. The chances were that they would have to battle the abomination eventually, and so Sunny wanted to glean its essence and commit it to his memory. Training his swordsmanship with Nephis, studying the estuary key, observing the azure serpent, and resting idly, these were the things that filled his days. Of course, other things were happening on the dark island as well. Imp was still busy devouring the bands of tarnished silver that encased the black turtle's body. His progress was slow, but the gluttonous goblin seemed beyond himself with delight. His scrawny figure could often be seen sprawled on the black rocks, utterly engorged. The sin of solace was still there, following Sunny like a jaded wraith. Its litany of snide comments and contemptuous remarks never lessened, slowly driving him mad. Sunny endured as best as he could, and luckily, the spirit of the cursed sword was not nearly as talkative as it had been before. Nevertheless, the apparition put him in many awkward situations with Nephis. Nightmare was slowly subjugating new dreams into his unseen army. Almost every night, the counter of the dream curse would go up by at least 1 or 2. The source of these defeated nightmares were, of course, Sunny and Nephis. It seemed that their minds were still haunted by the events of the past, or maybe it was just the nature of the tomb of Ariel. Despite its breathtaking facade, it was a land worthy of its architect, a land of dread. It was also as desolate and empty as it was beautiful. Every day, Sunny and Nephis would study the northern horizon, hoping to see the signs of land, or anything at all, far in the distance. But each time, all that met them was an endless expanse of flowing water. Their hunger slowly grew. Although masters were much more resilient than mundane humans, they were still the same. They needed sustenance to survive, just like any human would. Their bodies were still strong, but they would start to wither before too long. Before that happened, Sunny and Nephis were going to have to find a way to harvest some of the black turtle's meat. The azure serpent raised its head from the water every time it devoured more, as if to mock them. I'm hungry. Sunny was sitting on a luxurious wooden chair, which was positioned near the slopes of the black turtle's carapace, facing north. His shadows surrounded him, lazily sprawled on the black rocks and enjoying the dreamlike vista of the great river. Only the naughty one had wandered off to enjoy the view of Nephis training instead. Dismissing the estuary key, Sunny rubbed his temples and stretched his legs. I don't get it. I just don't get it. I don't recognize any of these weave elements, not even their vague purpose. The more I look at it, the more sure I am that it won't be, created by me. Whoever had created the key of the estuary was a far greater sorcerer than Sunny was, or could ever dream to be. At least that was how it seemed. All right, that's enough for today. The old snake should be showing its ugly mug any minute now. I really hope that it's as tired of staring at me as I am tired of staring at it. Sunny glanced at the wide patch of bloody water surrounding the shell of the great turtle in anticipation, lingered for a few moments, and then frowned. Something was wrong with that picture. He stared at the water for a while, his scowl deepening. Then, Sunny slowly raised his eyes and looked at the sky. His pupils widened slightly. There, in the boundless blue expanse, far away, a black dot had appeared at some point. Chapter 1261. A butterfly flapping its wings. There was a black dot in the sky, far in the distance, slowly moving in the direction of the dark island. At first, Sunny felt a glimmer of hope ignite in his heart as he remembered a similar situation from the past. That time, it had turned out to be Kai. But this time, his intuition was ringing alarm bells, and a cold feeling of dread crept from somewhere to grip him with icy claws. Sitting on the shadow chair, with his legs crossed, Sunny leaned back and sighed. Crap. With that, he exploded with a flurry of activity. First, Sunny dismissed his precious chair and dashed toward the middle of the island. At the same time, he sent a mental command to Saint. Nephis and she were currently engaged in a furious sword fight. Light and darkness were intertwined in a shimmering whirlpool of sharp steel, and the graceful knight's onyx figure was starkly contrasted against the rippling white tunic and alabaster skin of her slender opponent. Following Sunny's order, Saint froze. The tip of Neff's sword stopped a split second later, hovering millimeters away from the slit of her visor. Nephis frowned, then retracted her sword and looked around. There was a shadow on a rock outcropping that protruded from the ground a few meters away. It seemed to belong to a young man and was currently waving its arms in the air while pointing at the sky. She swiftly turned around and looked up, then dashed away a moment later. That's done. Running as fast as he could, Sunny leaped over a murky puddle of water and landed near a half-eaten fragment of tarnished silver. The scrawny figure of Imp could be seen nearby, laying on the ground with a blissful smile on his fiendish face. His hands were rubbing his ballooning belly with delight. Stand up, buddy. The gluttonous goblin opened his eyes and stared at Sunny in confusion, then awkwardly tried to rise to his feet. However, outweighed by his full stomach, Imp lost his balance and promptly plopped back down. We don't have time for this. Sunny leaned down, grabbed the weakly struggling fiend, and hoisted him on his shoulder. What the hell? Just how much had the little bastard swallowed up? Even with the strength of an ascended tyrant, Sunny was struggling to carry Imp. His veins swelled, and a befuddled expression appeared on his face. Commanding the shadows to wrap themselves around his body, he grunted and continued to run. A dozen seconds later, Sunny reached the edge of the familiar fissure and unceremoniously tossed the little fiend down. Then, he threw one more look at the sky and, noticing that the black dot had already drawn nearer, jumped into the deep ravine himself. Before too long, Nephis and he were side by side, pressing themselves into the weathered slope of the fissure as they desperately tried to calm down their breathing. Saint and Fiend were nearby, the former standing calmly, the latter hugging Sunny's thigh. Nightmare was there as well, hiding within the deep darkness, enveloping the bottom of the gorge in his shadow form. Lastly, a beautiful amphora of white clay was standing on the ground in front of them, its surface decorated with mesmerizing patterns. It was another one of the memories Summer Night had given to Nephis, and its purpose was to mask their presence. Gods only knew if the amphora was going to work or not. Out of Sunny's 5 shadows, one had to volunteer to leave its area of effect and serve as a scout, though. Well, perhaps volunteer was the wrong word, since the gloomy shadow had performed a few dangerous tasks recently, and the happy fool was not someone Sunny would ever entrust an important matter to. The next in seniority had to go. So, the creepy guy was currently hiding a few meters away from the edge of the fissure, staring creepily at the sky. The Sin of Solace was keeping it company with a bored expression on his face. The sparks swirling around Sunny's hand formed into an emerald flute, and he covered them with a dome of silence. Then he let out a shaky breath. I see it. Nephis looked at him intently, then asked in a low voice, "What is it?" Sunny lingered for a few moments. Slowly, his expression turned grim. "It's a butterfly." Indeed, a butterfly was descending toward the island. From afar, it seemed like an ethereal and beautiful creature, but as it drew closer, Sunny couldn't help but shiver. The butterfly's wings and back were black, but its body and underbelly were the color of white bone. It had 6 long, seemingly fragile legs that ended in sharp points, and 2 enormous, faceted eyes that were like orbs of pure darkness. Between them was a disturbingly long, oily black beak, which was currently bent into a spiral like an elephant's trunk. 2 antennae rose from its head, pushed back by the current of the wind. Apart from that, the butterfly was at least 100 meters in size. It was both exquisitely beautiful and deeply revolting. But, most of all, it was deeply frightening. Sunny gritted his teeth. "It's another great monster." His heart was beating rapidly in his chest, and his back was covered with cold sweat. "Great. This is just great." "Great, huh? It literally is." By his side, Nephis scowled. "What about?" The monstrous butterfly was obviously intending to land on the island, but at that moment the crimson water parted, and the azure serpent's scaled snout rose into the air. Pierced by a mad gaze of its cloudy eyes, the great monster suddenly seemed wary. It moved its wings and altered the direction of its flight, circling the corpse of the black turtle from above instead of diving down to land on the black rock. The butterfly's huge eyes were aimed at the ancient serpent, and its antennae twitched rhythmically. The great beast of the river bared its bloodied fangs and let out a furious roar, as if announcing its claim of the remains of the titanic turtle. This demented old snake. Did the serpent not want to live? Why was it going around challenging great monsters? Am I really such a delicacy? Sunny did not know what the giant butterfly was thinking, but one thing was certain. It did not like that serpent's challenge. It did not like it at all. Chapter 1262, A Shrimp Between 2 Whales. Sunny described what was happening in a hushed voice. He didn't really need to whisper, considering that they were surrounded by a dome of silence, but it made him feel better. And what was happening appeared pretty clear. The monstrous butterfly had been attracted by the smell of blood and arrived to feast on the corpse of the black turtle that the azure serpent had so laboriously killed. The azure serpent, meanwhile, was having none of it. In fact, judging by the madness burning in its eyes, the great beast was overcome with the bloody desire to rip the giant butterfly apart as well. This thing really doesn't know what's good for it, huh? What was the reason for the azure serpent's reckless insolence? Humans often describe nightmare creatures as mad, but that description was not entirely accurate. The abominations were indeed insane, but that did not mean that they lacked sanity. Rather, it meant that their sanity was perverted, sinister, ineffable, and entirely different from what humans deemed sane. So why would the great beast risk its life fighting much more powerful monsters? Was it indeed madness? Was it pride? Was it reluctance to give up such an enormous prize? Or was it more reluctant to surrender two human souls that burned the flames of divinity to the stronger abomination? Whatever the reason was, the stubborn Leviathan seemed ready to battle the monstrous butterfly to the death. The butterfly let out an indescribable sound. The waters of the great river suddenly grew restless, rippling as they were assaulted by the powerful sonic waves. The serpent roared again, rising higher above the river's tumultuous surface. I think they are going to fight. Sunny was not sure what it meant for the two of them. He was belatedly happy about his decision to abandon the skies and seek shelter on the shell of the black turtle. If something like that butterfly had caught him in the air, he would have surely been dead in an instant. However, now that Nephis and he were trapped on the dark island, their fate seemed to be swaying on the edge of a perilous abyss. They were deeply unsure of their ability to slay a great beast, but a great monster was far more dreadful. They were only alive now because the azure serpent either lacked the ability or was reluctant to crawl out of the water. If the abominable butterfly won the battle, though, nothing was going to stop it from doing just that. Then, their shelter would turn into a deadly trap. So, no matter how strange it sounded, Sunny had no choice but to root for the familiar great beast that had been staring at them hungrily for many days, wishing to swallow them whole. The azure serpent had already killed one great monster. Maybe the mad snake would be able to pull off another miracle. Finally coming to a decision, the butterfly waved its wings and plummeted down, landing on the shell of the black turtle a moment later. The entire island shook from the devastating force of the impact. The creepy shadow remained motionless as it looked up at the 6 incredibly thin and long legs of the monster. The pale body of the butterfly was high above the ground, and its wings were open, covering a vast area in deep darkness. Now that it was closer, Sunny could see that it was covered in thick scales with white hairs growing between them. There was a complicated pattern on the creature's wings, as well, coalescing into a strange image. An image of. Sunny hurriedly commanded the shadow to look away as a strange certainty that he should never ever try to look directly at the pattern covering the butterfly's wings flooded his mind. Damnation. Sunny? What is happening? He sucked in a shaky breath. They're just staring at each other. The butterfly shifted slightly, the sharp tips of its chitinous legs striking sparks from the black rock. Its trunk-like mouth slowly unfurled, turning into a fearsome black spear dozens of meters long. The abomination let out another harrowing screech, then suddenly struck the surface of the dead turtle's shell with its beak. 1, 2, 3 times. The island quaked, but not even a thin crack appeared on the rock. The butterfly froze for a moment, then twisted its head, looking at the azure serpent. It seemed reluctant to go into the water. Well, of course, one is a flying abomination and the other is a sea creature. The butterfly has to go into the water if it wants to gorge on the black turtle's meat, but that would mean fighting the azure serpent, and on the enemy's home ground no less. Maybe it would simply retreat. Just as Sunny thought that, the butterfly suddenly folded its wings and lunged forward. There was no hesitation, no warning, just a deafening sonic boom and a harrowing black and white blur that suddenly shot toward the serpent like a gigantic javelin. A hurricane gale rose from the confounding fury of the great monster's lunge. It's attacking. A split second later, an enormous pillar of foaming crimson water rose into the sky. The serpent seemed to have managed to avoid the abominable butterfly's obliterating charge. However, its sharp legs tore at the sea creature's azure body. The great monster easily dove into the water, as though the depths were its home. Both creatures were suddenly hidden from view, and only the shaking of the island and the colossal waves that were assaulting its slopes showed that a titanic battle was happening underwater. They're fighting. Nephis remained silent for a few moments, then gave him a strange look. Sunny, where are they fighting, in relation to our position? He stared at her in confusion, then said, below water, to the left of the turtle's tail. She lingered a bit, then took a deep breath. Then, they're on the opposite side from the turtle's head, where the entry wound is. So, while the serpent is preoccupied, shall we dive down and harvest some meat? He opened his mouth, startled. Then, he slowly closed it again. Dive down? Harvest meat? Are you crazy? Damn, I said it again. Nephis looked at him very seriously and shook her head. No, I'm not crazy. I'm hungry. Chapter 1263, Sea of Blood. What they were trying to do did, indeed, seem a little crazy. There were two great abominations fighting on one side of the black turtle, and Nephis wanted to dive into the water on the other side to steal some of the turtle's meat, because she was hungry. But of course it was really not that unhinged of a plan. She had not suggested it out of a burning desire to satiate her belly. Rather, it was out of necessity. The longer they were to go hungry, the weaker they would become. The weaker they became, the slimmer their chances of survival would be. Neither Nephis nor Sunny knew if they would get a better chance to harvest the black turtle's meat than now, when the azure serpent was distracted. In fact, they did not even know if they would live long enough to enjoy the fruits of this perilous decision. If the monstrous butterfly won, they would probably die soon, but there was nothing they could really do about that, so the only thing they could do was prepare for the other outcome to the best of their ability. Grimacing, Sunny looked away and shook Imp off his thigh. Curses. Then he gritted his teeth and started climbing out of the fissure. Hungry. She's hungry. Hungry. Is she? Just what sin did I commit in my past life to be cursed with all these gluttonous women? Oblivious to his heartfelt plea, Nephis followed. It took Sunny just a few moments to scale the vertical slope of the deep fissure and climb onto the quaking surface of the dark island. It was shaking and swaying, pushed by the harrowing fury of the unseen battle that was happening below the waves. A split second later, Saint landed nearby, and a vast shadow crawled from the darkness to take the shape of a tenebrous steed. Neph arrived last, slowed down a little by the need to carry the fragile amphora in one of her hands. Imp had been left in the relative safety of the fissure, since he was of no use in the current situation. Sunny and Nephis glanced at each other and then broke into a sprint without having to say anything. Their goal was the end of the island beneath which the black turtle's enormous head was floating in the crimson water. It was also where the azure serpent had broken through the great monster's silver armor and burrowed into its flesh, leaving behind a gaping wound. Since the scales of the creature were all but impervious, the meat could only be harvested from inside such a spot. As they were nearing the point where the shell of the black turtle started to slope down at a steep angle, Sunny sighed and dismissed the shroud of dusk. Left in just his underwear, he ignored Neph's strange gaze and summoned the nimble catch and the essence pearl instead. I've traded a couple of memories just for such an occasion, from the House of Night. She lingered for a moment, then looked away. Oh. While the nimble catch was weaving itself from the sparks of light, Sunny threw a glance at his body and frowned a little. He had always been lean, and while his muscles simply refused to gain bulk, they had been like taut steel wire cables ever since the Forgotten Shore. Now, however, they had become a little bit too sculpted and defined. His abs were really like a washboard, which was not good at all. He had lost a lot of weight during the hellish journey through the Nightmare Desert and the days of hunger on the carcass of the black turtle. His body was all skin and muscle, with no fat left, which meant that it would start to devour itself next. Some men strived for such a physique, but for Sunny, who had grown up in the outskirts, it was a worrying sign. We really need to get that meat. As the strange garb woven out of a fisherman's net covered his pale skin, he noticed that Nephis was giving him a sideways glance again, for some reason. Slightly confused, he said, "Summon that." But he did not have to say anything. The familiar golden rope was already manifesting in her hands. They needed to dive into the tumultuous red water to harvest the monster's meat, but they didn't have to be stupid about it. If something happened, Sunny could swiftly pull them away through the shadows. However, finding a proper shadow to dive into was hard underwater. And since the great river was in the throes of the battle between the azure serpent and the monstrous butterfly, its current could easily pull Sunny and Nephis apart. She threw him one end of the golden rope, and he hastily tied it around his left wrist while she tied the other end around her right. At the same time, light swirled around Neph's slender legs and formed into two silver anklets. Sunny stared at them in confusion for a moment, before realizing that their function had to be similar to the nimble catch. He was a bit envious. Hers was not an armor-type memory, so she did not have to dismiss the white tunic. I want to be sponsored by a guilt-ridden saint, too. Holding the black bow, Saint took a position that gave her a perfect view of the head of the dead monster and the seething water surrounding it. Her task was to protect, or at least try to protect them should either the serpent or the butterfly arrive. Nightmare could not help her in case the former showed up, but if the latter did, his speed would have to assist Saint in leading the butterfly away. The amphora was placed beside them. Sunny and Nephis looked at each other one last time, then dashed forward and simultaneously jumped. The wind whistled in his ears. A few moments later, Sunny hit the crimson water and was instantly swallowed by it. It was like he had dove into a sea of blood. Everything around him was murky and red. Despite his best efforts, Sunny was momentarily disoriented, but regained his bearings after feeling a sharp tug on the golden rope. He found Neph through shadow sense and followed her as she swam forward with purpose. She had already done this once, after all. Granted, There had not been two great nightmare creatures creating a storm nearby at that time. We need to be fast. Breathing with the help of the essence pearl, Sunny swam through the crimson waters of the great river. Chapter 1264 Gaping Wound. Guided by a golden rope that glowed faintly into the red murkiness, Sunny swam forward. The waters of the river of time, mixed with the crimson blood of a great monster, were cold and tumultuous. The battle of two harrowing abominations had turned them into a whirlpool of raging currents. Just how far is this wound? Suddenly, Sunny saw something enormous appear from the murky red darkness and shuddered. He was swimming past the giant eye of the titanic turtle, now hollow and devoid of light. His figure was like a speck of dust in front of it. The azure serpent had long feasted on the black turtle's left eye, but the right still remained. Even though Sunny knew that the ancient behemoth was dead, he couldn't help but feel as if it was staring at him. Looking away, he pushed himself through the water. We're not far from the creature's neck then. Every second could be their last, so Sunny was tense. The battle of the dreadful abominations could shift in their direction at any moment. More than that, the nimble catch allowed him to swim with great speed, and Neff's silver anklets were the same. However, she did not seem to possess a memory similar to the essence pearl, and had to hold her breath. They simply couldn't linger. Fortunately, the dark thoroughfare of the turtle's enormous neck emerged from the cloudy redness soon. It was encased in massive bands of tarnished silver, which overlapped to form a flexible but impenetrable armor. Sunny caught up with Nephis as they followed the road of silver to the point where the monster's neck ended. There, its armor was torn apart and bent, sharp jagged edges surrounded by bloody foam. The stench of blood was much stronger here, and the water was much darker. Nephis changed her direction, knowing where to go. A dozen seconds later, they reached the gaping wound in the body of the great monster. Sunny froze for a moment. The azure serpent had not just ripped a chunk of flesh out of the black turtle's flesh, it actually burrowed inside like a hungry worm, tore through the insides of the monster, and then crawled out from a similar wound under one of the creature's flippers. As a result, the wound in front of them was like a dark tunnel, not too different from the one through which he had guided the convoy of refugees in the Antarctica Center. The scale of it was humbling. I actually said that I can kill that damned snake, didn't I? Nephis tugged on the rope to get his attention, then pointed forward. Struggling against unexplainable fear, Sunny reluctantly pushed himself in that direction. At that moment, the entire corpse of the black turtle tilted, impacted by the shockwave of the terrifying clash between the azure serpent and the invading butterfly. It swayed slowly, and the dark tunnel of the harrowing wound started to move up. By the time they reached it, half of the gaping, bloody hole was above the surface of the water, while the other half was still submerged in it. A red current was flowing out, trying to push them away. Sunny gritted his teeth and struggled against the flow, eventually entering the dark tunnel. Then, however, the current was reversed, and a great amount of water flowed into the body of the dead monster, pulling them deeper inside. Crap! Sunny was carried into the depths of the black turtle's corpse with dire speed, slamming against its flesh and holding tightly to the golden rope. After what felt like an eternity, the current grew weak, and he managed to climb onto something solid. Sunny pulled on the rope, and a second later, Nephis appeared from the water as well. She raised her hand, igniting a wisp of white flame on it to illuminate their surroundings. He took a deep breath, suddenly realizing how close the two of them were standing. After taking a bath in the diluted blood of the black turtle, both looked like a horror show. However, Sunny couldn't help but notice how tightly Neff's wet tunic stuck to her body, and how close to transparent the light fabric became. He shifted slightly, then forcibly tore his gaze away and studied the dark tunnel of the great monster's bleeding flesh. It looked exactly like one would imagine such a place to look. Not that people had reasons to try and imagine something so morbidly bizarre. The walls of the tunnel, which was mostly consumed by darkness, were uneven, spongy, and red. The lower half of it was covered by tumultuous water, while the upper half was filled with an almost unbearable stench of blood. Rivers of red were flowing from the walls and the ceiling, mixing with the dark water below. Sunny and Nephis were standing on one of the vertebrae of the black turtle, which protruded from the bottom of the tunnel like a pale pink mountain. While he was looking around, she was breathing heavily. So, now... Before he could finish the sentence, the carcass of the great monster quaked once again, and the two of them were almost thrown off the slippery bone. Sunny had to grab Nephis to prevent her from plummeting back into the seething water. A moment later, he realized that they were embracing, their bodies pressed tightly against each other. He could feel the softness and the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of the white tunic. Her striking gray eyes were close, Too close, as well. Forgetting what he was going to say, Sunny remained motionless for a few moments. Then, he made sure that Nephis had regained her balance and carefully let her go. So, now, all we have to do is carve some meat, right? She cleared her throat, then raised the wisp of flame higher and looked away. Right. And return alive. Sunny let out a shaky sigh. Sure. One thing at a time. Chapter 1265, Dirty Job. Sunny had to spend a few moments calming down his wildly beating heart. Then he looked around once again. The situation was much better than he had expected it to be. He really had not considered that the grotesque tunnel left behind by the Azure Serpent would be only partially drowned. Slicing through the flesh of a great monster was no easy task, and doing so underwater would have been even harder. More than that, he was less restricted in the use of Shadow Step now. But, most importantly, he could summon the covetous coffer. Opening the alloy chest underwater would have just resulted in the spatial storage being instantly filled with water. Now that they stood on a solid surface, things were different. Of course, the tunnel could be flooded at any moment, so they had to hurry. Sunny looked at Nephis and flashed her a smile. Let's be quick. The sparks of light swirled around them, manifesting into memories. Neph's flame was replaced by a luminous paper lantern, and a sizable alloy chest appeared on the porous pink surface of the great monster's bone. A moment later, their weapons manifested. Tai, am I reduced to a mere butcher's cleaver? Such humiliation. Sunny almost yelped when a familiar figure emerged from the darkness. The Sin of Solace looked somberly at his disheveled appearance, then shook his head. He was still clad in the shroud of graceless dusk, not to mention perfectly dry. Damn fool. Sunny whispered a stifled curse and commanded the shadows to wrap themselves around the jade blade of the cursed sword, which had manifested itself a split second before. Then he hissed, "Gods, you almost gave me a heart attack." Nephis froze for a moment and looked at him with a slightly startled expression. "Oh, did I? Sorry." Sunny's eyes widened. "No, not you. I wasn't talking. Never mind." The Sin of Solace observed him with a small, disdainful smile. "I must say, this is a peculiar location for a date. Harvesting monster meat from inside the monster. I hope you won't force the poor girl to cook the meal herself, at least." Struggling to ignore the bastard, Sunny threw the lid of the covetous coffer open and then moved closer to the wall of the flesh tunnel. Pushing down the feeling of disgust, he gritted his teeth and thrust the Gean forward. It was so strange. The taste of the black turtle's meat was truly sublime, but the source of it was so revolting. Damn it. One of the enchantments of the Sin of Solace made it incredibly sharp, and it had been augmented by the shadows on top of that. And yet, cutting into the flesh of the dead great monster felt like he was trying to cut stone with a rusty blade. Sunny had known that harvesting the turtle's meat would not be easy, just from the fact that chewing it was a tough task. However, the actual difficulty of trying to slice off a sizable chunk of the abomination's flesh was even greater than he had expected. Its durability in an uncooked state was simply preposterous. If that's hard, then how am I going to fight one of these things in the future? With no other choice, Sunny concentrated on the task. Taut muscles rolled under his skin as he put all his strength into it, and the jade blade cut deeper with excruciating slowness. Nephis was just as strained, using a sharp dagger instead of her longsword. Its blade was glowing with incandescent light, and her face was pale. Despite that, her progress was not much faster than his. The dark island continued to sway and quake around them, making the water filling the morbid tunnel roll and slosh. Carving the meat was hard, and doing it while struggling to keep balance was especially hard. Nevertheless, they continued, sometimes using each other for support. This is taking too long. Sunny had hoped to fill the covetous coffer to the brim, but now he realized how unrealistic his lofty desires were. At this rate, it would be good if they managed to harvest enough to feed them for a few days. Of course, as long as the battle between the Azure Serpent and the eerie butterfly did not end or shift in their direction, there was still time. And just as he threw the first chunk of meat into the maw of the alloy chest, the carcass of the black turtle quaked again. This time, however, there was something different about the tremor. Instead of being pushed to the side, Sunny had almost been thrown up into the air. Nephis and he abruptly stopped, looking at each other. Sunny's mouth was suddenly very dry. They are below us now. The whole plan was hinged on the fact that the massive bulk of the black turtle would protect them from the two battling abominations. Now, the area of the battle was shifting, and the creatures were already below the dark island. This meant that they were moving in the direction of the turtle's head. Neff's eyes shone in the gloomy darkness as they reflected the glow of her scorching dagger. She lingered for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Sonny paused for a bit, then gritted his teeth. "We've already taken the risk. Returning with empty hands would mean that it was all for nothing. We'll have to wait for a chance to do it all over again, and even if such a chance presents itself, we'll be much weaker by then. So, let's continue. I can pull us back through the shadows anyway." Nephis nodded in agreement, prompting them to return to the arduous task of carving the turtle's flesh. Both of them were much more tense now. A few more slabs of meat fell into the covetous coffer, and at the same time, the shock waves traveling through the island showed that the battling abominations were drawing closer to the creature's head. Eventually, Sonny lowered his bloodied hands and grimaced. "That's enough. It is too dangerous now." Closing the lid of the alloy chest, he dismissed it and froze for a moment, concentrating his perception on the haughty shadow. He had left it with Saint and Nightmare, so it had a good view of the turbulent waters surrounding the black turtle's head. The water had been turbulent before, but now it was simply boiling. Bloody foam was undulating like a stormy sea, and two enormous shadows could be seen far below, intertwined with each other. They were just under the entrance to the gaping wound at the base of the titanic turtle's neck. "Time to go." Grabbing Neef's hand, Sonny pulled the two of them into the shadow, but nothing happened. The shadows remained ethereal and elusive, as if he had never possessed the ability to dive into their dark embrace. Sonny froze, then slowly looked down. He was still standing on the slippery pink bone. Shadow Step had failed to activate. Chapter 1266, Unexpected Complication. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Two identical questions sounded at the same time, but they couldn't be more different. Neff's voice was tinged with a hint of sincere concern, while the voice of the sword wraith was full of biting mockery. Sonny was motionless for a few moments, still holding Nephis by her hand. He shivered slightly after his second attempt to use Shadow Step failed, and she must have felt it. He looked up at her and hesitated. When he spoke, his voice sounded hollow. "My ability doesn't seem to work anymore." An insidious fear suddenly drowned his heart, and at the same time, the dark island quaked again, the source of the tremor much closer than it had been before. The fear was irrational and animalistic. It had little to do with their perilous situation, and more with that fact that his powers had abandoned him without a warning. It was as though he had suddenly found himself missing a limb. There was disbelief, confusion, dread, and finally, terror. It took all his willpower to push that terror down. The sin of solace laughed. Ignoring it, Sonny forced himself to speak. Just give me a moment." He had no idea why Shadow Step, which had never failed him before, was suddenly ineffective. Perhaps something was wrong with the shadows populating the insides of the black turtle. If so, there was an easy way to check. A few moments later, the shadow lantern appeared in his hand, and a flood of shadows flowed out of its open gate. However, the result was the same. It was not the shadows that were wrong, but Sonny himself. Really, such an idiot." The damned sword wraith was having the time of his life. Sonny clenched his fists, then uttered through gritted teeth, "I don't seem to be able to bring us away at the moment. Sorry." Nephis frowned, then carefully looked around. After a short pause, she suddenly said, "In hindsight, it makes sense." Feeling a sudden sense of hope, he raised an eyebrow. "It does?" She nodded. "It is a great monster, after all, and we are inside its body. A creature like that would have protections against someone like you bypassing its fearsome armor by teleporting directly inside. The black turtle is dead, but some of its defenses must still remain. Perhaps if the gap in power between us wasn't so vast, your ability could have still tore through them." Sonny remained silent for a few moments. "Why didn't I think about that before?" Nephis shook her head. "I didn't either. Don't you think that blaming yourself is too much? We couldn't have known. We've never faced an enemy such as this." She was right, but she was also wrong. Sonny might not have tried to enter the body of a colossal enemy through Shadow Step before, but he saw how the Azure Serpent had killed the black turtle. He could have at least considered the possibility of doing something similar. In any case, everything seemed simple in hindsight. He winced, then looked at Nephis silently. As if reading his thoughts, she guided her flames from the blade of the incandescent dagger through her body and into his, but the result was the same. Shadow Step was refusing to activate. After feeling the warmth of Neff's flame leaving him, Sonny drew in a shaky breath and belatedly realized that he was still holding her hand. He was in no hurry to let go. finding it reassuring. A deep frown appeared on Sunny's face as he looked in the direction of the entrance of the tunnel. Right now, the azure serpent and the great monster it was fighting were exceedingly close to the gaping wound, making the prospect of leaving the way they had come absolutely lethal. What were their options, though? Staying here was tantamount to death as well. Actually, there is a third option. Sunny turned around and looked into the depths of the tunnel, then pulled Nephis forward. Let's go. The entrance is blocked, but there's still the exit. The old snake burrowed right through, didn't it? The exit wound is on the other side of the turtle's body, under its flipper. We'll escape through there and climb back onto the island. That was the most rational decision he could make. The two of them hesitated for a moment, and then dove back into the seething water. Shortening the length of the golden rope to keep them closer to each other, Sunny and Nephis swam through the diluted blood of the slain behemoth. Even though fighting against the current was incredibly hard, they moved further away from the harrowing battle with each stroke. Hurry, hurry. Sunny felt a dire urgency and pushed himself forward with as much strength as he could muster. The tunnel was not that long. The entire body of the black turtle spanned less than 2 kilometers, and the bloody path the azure serpent had burrowed through had to be half that. Of course, it was twisting and turning, and the chaotic movement of the water made it difficult to advance. But still, they were going to reach the exit soon. As they swam, they witnessed more signs of the destruction that the great river beast had wreaked, both when killing the black turtle and while feeding on its flesh later on. The walls of the tunnel sometimes expanded into vast caverns where the turtle's organs had been, now torn to pieces and completely obliterated. Pieces of bone and tough cartilage protruded from the darkness. Sunny found it all both grotesque and strangely, darkly mesmerizing. I am swimming through a great monster. I feel like it's a dream. Well, it was. A nightmare, to be precise. Just as they passed the middle point of the tunnel and felt the current change, pulling them in the direction of their goal, he suddenly noticed something strange. Out there, a small distance in front of them, it was as though something was softly shining in the darkness. The glow was so faint that Sunny thought that he was mistaken, but the next time his head broke the surface, he saw it again. After hesitating for a moment, he suddenly pulled on the golden rope and pushed his tired body against the current once again, trying to make his way to the source of the strange glow. Nephis and Sunny climbed onto a frayed piece of cartilage and looked at the wall of the tunnel. Out there, hidden in the folds of torn flesh, he took a deep breath. Was an enormous, radiant crystal that shone with ethereal light. It was one of the 2 supreme soul shards that the death of the black turtle would have left behind. Sunny briefly glanced at Nephis, then summoned the covetous coffer once more. The shard was too large to fit into the opening of the alloy chest, so he concentrated and changed it, keeping the shape but changing the size. A few moments later, the alloy chest seemed more like an alloy sarcophagus fit for a giant or someone like the shadow spawn. I can't believe it. We came down to harvest some meat but ended up with something like that. Gods, I can't even imagine how much it would cost in the waking world. Actually, it wouldn't have a cost. These things are so rare that they can't be bought with money. Even though they were pressed for time, he just couldn't let this chance slip through his fingers. Neph, can you help me? Together, they hacked at the fold of the turtle's flesh to widen the opening, and then used all their strength to lift the massive soul shard and load it into the opened maw of the covetous coffer. After that, they had to plunge into the water again. Several torturous minutes later, Sunny and Nephis used the silver chains at the side of the island to scale the slope of the black turtle's shell, and fell side by side on the rocks in exhaustion. Knowing how Neph would look in her wet tunic, Sunny refused to turn his head and instead stared at the sky. The warm feeling of their arms touching was enough for him. They needed to move, to hide, but he was too tired. Just a few moments, Sunny took a deep breath and tried to calm down a little. Then he suddenly let out a low chuckle. But it's funny. After examining the estuary key, he had thought it impossible to collect 1, let alone 6 supreme soul shards. The idea itself seemed utterly preposterous. And yet, here he was just a couple of weeks later, in possession of 1. It had just fallen into his hands, almost on its own. A strange shiver ran up his spine. It was then that Nephis suddenly raised her hand and whispered. There, in the sky above the island, the monstrous butterfly was spreading its black wings once again. Chapter 1267, Candlelight. Sunny and Nephis scrambled in an attempt to find a hiding spot, but there was no need. Their first thought was that the dreadful butterfly had won the battle against the azure serpent. If that was the case, then their fates would be sealed. However, a moment later, a deafening roar shook the world, pushing them to the ground. Turning to the stormy waters of the great river, they saw a familiar creature rising to the surface. The serpent was looking the worse for wear, with countless deep lacerations covering its mighty body. Streams of scarlet blood were flowing down its azure scales, and its giant eyes seemed even more deranged than usual. Flames of indescribable, murderous malice were burning in their cloudy depths, but, for once, that malice was not directed at the two humans. Instead, it was aimed at the battered butterfly. Now that Sunny and Nephis had a few moments to observe the great monster in detail, they noticed that it was in a sorry state too. One of its 6 legs was missing, and there was an ugly tear on one of its beautiful wings. Its body looked strangely disheveled, and although none of the white scales covering it were missing, many of them were covered with thin cracks. The great monster was retreating. Sunny froze, momentarily stunned. Even though he had hoped that the azure serpent would win the battle against the much stronger nightmare creature, he could not quite believe that it actually happened. Old snake, just what damned kind of abomination are you? It was already miraculous for a great beast to defeat a great monster. 2 of them, though. While not impossible, it was certainly abnormal. Even if the monstrous butterfly was an aerial creature, and was thus at a disadvantage while fighting underwater, the tenacity of the azure serpent was confounding. Sunny stared at the bloodied leviathan somberly. As if sensing his gaze, the serpent lowered its snout and glared back at him. Crimson water was flowing out of its slightly opened maw. He shivered. It's no mere beast. Indeed, he should have known. His luck wasn't good enough to stumble on just any great beast. No, it surely had to be some kind of unique and singular existence, a damn monarch among all beasts. Wouldn't have it any other way. Maybe it was no coincidence that the azure serpent had come from much further upstream than the other 2 abominations. Ah, curse it. Sunny felt conflicted. On the one hand, he should be ecstatic about the fact that the harrowing butterfly was retreating. On the other hand, the ancient river serpent seemed much more dangerous now. The butterfly, meanwhile, was swiftly rising higher and higher. However, it didn't leave. Instead of disappearing into the distance, the great monster turned into a black dot once again and started to slowly circle the island from above. It looked like the creature was not giving up on the carcass of the black turtle, just recovering its strength and biding its time to make another attempt. The azure serpent threw one last hateful glance at it and then dove into the water with an angry hiss. Soon, the island shook slightly, hinting that the abomination was devouring more of the turtle's meat, perhaps to restore its power. The tumultuous water slowly calmed down. Left in the sudden silence, Sunny and Nephis stared at the vast expanse of the great river in exhaustion. After a while, he slowly exhaled. I guess it seems we survived. She nodded slowly. Yeah. I'll go find a deep pond. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Huh? What was she talking about? A pond? Why? He looked at her in confusion, prompting Nephis to sigh. Why do you think? We just took a bath in a river of blood. I want to wash myself, of course. Sunny tilted his head, only now realizing how nasty Nephis looked. Well, he was no better. A sly smile appeared on his lips. Suddenly feeling mischievous, Sunny asked, "Can I join?" She was already turning away. No. Go find your own pond, if you want. He laughed. Wait. What if I drown? Those fissures are very deep, you know. Nephis scoffed. If you do drown, maybe take the meat out of that storage memory first. It will be sad if it just disappears, after everything we went through. Sunny watched her go. The silver anklets were singing a quiet melody as they bounced with each graceful step. Eventually, he shook his head in dejection. Does she only care about the meat? How heartless. Later that day, when the 7 suns had already plunged into the water, Sunny and Nephis were back in their makeshift camp at the bottom of the deep fissure. By now, it didn't look as desolate and barren as it had before. There was a fire pit assembled from the black rocks. The shadow chair and the covetous coffer, back to its usual size, were standing nearby. Neff's sleeping bag was laying on one side of the pit, while Sunny had gathered soft moss to serve as bedding on the other, using the overpriced saddle as a pillow. Imp was sprawled on the ground, still digesting the huge amount of tarnished silver he had devoured. Saint was standing guard above, and Nightmare was hiding in the shadows. Currently, the camp was illuminated by a softly glowing lantern, and a delicious fragrance of roasting meat was spreading through the air. Nephis was preparing a late supper over the coals. Not only that, but she had also gone all out, for some reason, using an inventive mix of spices to thoroughly marinate the meat before placing it above the glowing embers. Both of them had washed the stench of blood off their bodies, and were now preparing for sleep, feeling refreshed. Before that, however, they were going to finally satiate the gnawing hunger. In that moment, the lethally dangerous trip into the carcass of the black turtle they had undertaken seemed well worth it. Finally done, Nephis placed a generous chunk of meat on a plate and handed it to Sunny. In the last moment, though, she suddenly retracted her hand and hesitated. "Can you wait a moment?" Sunny felt warm and relaxed, so he didn't mind waiting. "Sure." He watched her across the glowing embers with peaceful idleness. Nephis seemed to be looking for something. A few moments later, she found a splinter of the synthetic fire brick they had used to light the fire and thrust it into the meat. Then she touched it with the tip of her finger, and a wisp of white flame ignited at the top of the small stick. Sunny received the strange dish with a confused look. What is this?" A faint smile appeared on Nep's face. "A candle." He hesitated for a few moments, then scratched the back of his head. "Why?" She leaned back and shrugged softly. "I'm not quite sure how many days it has been since the start of the nightmare, but the battle happened at the end of November, and we spent around a week in the desert. So, it should be middle to late December now." Sunny frowned. "And?" Nephis sighed and shook her head. "It means that it has to be winter solstice back in the real world. It's your birthday, Sunny." He stared at her in astonishment. "Wait, she's right." Sunny had forgotten all about it. It was winter solstice, or at least close to it. Out there in the waking world, an army of sleepers was entering the dream realm for the first time, if Antarctica still stood, that is. It was also his birthday. He was turning 21. He tilted his head a little. 21. I didn't really think I'd make it so far. Good job, Sunny. He looked at the burning stick, not noticing the bright smile that appeared on his lips. Nephis leaned forward a little. If I were you, I would hurry up and make a wish. Wish? 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 Hidden by shadows. Sunny's smile grew brittle and strained. Chapter 1268, Azure Serpent. There were a lot of things Sunny desperately wished for. However, the ominous words carved into a random piece of flotsam he had encountered by chance weighed heavily on his heart. So, he held himself back and made a point of not wishing for anything. A pity. Sunny blew out the improvised candle and hungrily sunk his teeth into the juicy meat. The taste of it was indescribable. So delicious. Nephis had really outdone herself this time. To think that she could cook up something so tasty with so few ingredients. Even the memories of the grotesque tunnel could not slow Sunny down. He attacked the roasted meat like a hungry wolf, annihilating it in no time. He still had to put some effort into chewing, but that only made the rich flavor and delightful texture last longer on his tongue. Some time later, both Sunny and Nephis were pleasantly satiated and sprawled on the ground, looking very much like Imp. Sunny was very much relaxed and sleepy, as well as in a great mood. Well, it was his birthday, after all. Surviving one more year was enough of a reason to celebrate, especially considering how many odious things he had lived through to get to today. Plus, the great monster's meat, which Nephis had marinated and roasted over the coals, was truly sublime. Come to think of it, she had silently assumed the role of the cohort cook from the moment they met on the forgotten shore. Whenever the cohort was together, Nephis was the one to feed everyone. The dishes she prepared were always filling, flavorful, and just right. That was a strange talent of hers. Maybe I should hire her as chef when I open my restaurant. Sunny smiled. There was one thing slightly bothering him, though. A talent like this did not really fit her stern and knightly persona. How come Nephis knew how to cook, so splendidly, at that? Sunny turned his head and looked at her. Hey, can I ask something? Why are you so good at cooking? Doesn't seem like something you would be passionate about. Of course it didn't. Nephis was only passionate about one thing, and to such a startling degree that it left no room for any other passions. She remained silent for a few moments. Wilderness survival. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. Huh? Nephis shrugged. Did you think that children from the legacy clans are only taught how to swing swords? You studied wilderness survival at the academy, so you must know how important survival skills are in the dream realm. Therefore, we learn to take care of ourselves in harsh conditions from childhood. Nutrition is an integral part of survival, and so it gets a lot of attention in the curriculum. She paused before adding, at least that's how it was for me. Each clan has its own way of teaching its heirs, of course. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Makes sense. I should have guessed myself. He smiled. So, what you're saying is that you've been taking cooking classes since childhood. Hearing his words, Nephis frowned. Not cooking classes. I've been taught both theoretical and practical skills concerning proper nutrition. It was a series of very thorough and elevated courses. Sunny nodded a couple of times with a ponderous expression. All right, I'm convinced. You're hired. She stared at him in confusion. You're hired? What? Are you talking to your sword again? Sunny vigorously shook his head. No, I'm talking to you. Nephis remained silent for a while, then let out a long sigh. Sometimes I really don't understand what you're saying. He grinned. Don't worry, that makes two of us. With that, Sunny laughed and turned away. Anyway, good night, Neph. There was a moment of silence, and then she dismissed the memory lantern, plunging the deep fissure into darkness. Good night, Sunny. The carcass of an ancient behemoth floated on the currents of the great river, and two humans slept peacefully in a crack in its shell. Their lives slowly changed after the appearance of the dreadful butterfly, but, strangely, not by much. Both Sunny and Nephis spent their days pretty much as they had before. They trained together, ate together, and rested on the soft moss together. Sometimes, Neph would go off to practice swordsmanship on her own, while Sunny would study the estuary key or sit motionlessly for hours, observing the azure serpent. He could feel his technique slowly improving as the small imperfections left within its principles and application were tempered and refined. He could also feel his understanding of the great beast deepening bit by bit. Only the key of the estuary remained a complete mystery. By now, Sunny had a faint suspicion that its weave encompassed two separate patterns. One was hidden within the other, with its function aimed inside. The other was much more vast and complicated, with its function directed outside. Both were stunning, ingenious, and inseparably intertwined. He had no idea what either of the patterns was supposed to do, though. Troublesome. When the tapestry of black strings started to blur in front of his tired eyes, Sunny would turn his attention back to the azure serpent. The frenzied creature was not having a great time. It continued to devour the flesh of the black turtle day after day, waiting patiently for the opportunity to consume Sunny and Nephis. But now it had to contend with the monstrous butterfly, which was a harrowing adversary. The butterfly descended from the sky on the third day after their first battle, and then again on the sixth. Both times, the two great abominations fought to a bloody draw, and the winged horror chose to retreat. Nephis hid in the fissure while the creatures were battling, but Sunny secretly stalked them from the shadows. Extending his shadow sense deep into the water, he followed the azure serpent as it furiously fought against the great monster. Watching someone fight with their life on the line was the best way to truly get to know them, after all. Just these two battles pushed Sunny's understanding of the mad Leviathan further than days of peaceful observation. The azure serpent was proud and powerful and absolutely insane. Its madness was even more terrifying than the sinister frenzy consuming the minds of all nightmare creatures. It was also insidiously cunning and exceedingly lethal, possessing a frightening combat acumen that must have been honed by experiencing thousands of perilous battles. This was why the great river serpent managed to send the more powerful creature retreating 3 times in a row. On the 7th day after their first battle, however, a new change shook the dark island. Chapter 12, 69, Third Contender. This time, Nephis was the first to notice the anomaly. Sunny and she were resting after an exhausting spar. He was meditating with his eyes closed, while she was leaning her back on him, still catching her breath. He sensed a sudden tensing of her muscles, and then the warm pressure was gone. Opening his eyes, Sunny glanced at Nephis and noticed that she was looking intently into the distance, where the endlessly flowing waters of the great river were sparkling under the light of the 7 suns. The azure serpent was nowhere in sight, and the island was not trembling, which meant that it was circling the stone shell of the black turtle. The monstrous butterfly was a small black dot in the sky. What had caught her attention then? What is it? Nephis lingered for a few moments, then pointed at a distant patch of water downstream of them. There, can you see it? Following her gaze, Sunny studied the currents. After a while, a scowl appeared on his face too. I can, but what are we looking at? There, still far away from the dark island, a span of the great river seemed different from the rest of its vast expanse. From their position, it was no larger than a coin, which meant that the strange anomaly was thousands of meters wide. It did not seem too threatening. The water surface was simply a bit rough there, as if rippling under a strong gale. The problem was that such a gale would probably affect a larger area, not just a relatively small and strangely distinct patch of water. A much bigger problem was that this patch seemed to be moving purposefully in their direction. Sonny wasn't sure at first, but after observing the river for a dozen seconds, he grew certain that it was no mere coincidence. In these dozen seconds, the rough patch had already drawn visibly closer. His face darkened. It has to be another abomination. Nephis slowly nodded. I think so too. For a few moments, both of them remained silent. It was only logical that a new nightmare creature would appear sooner or later. They had already met 3, each of them harrowing in its own way. The arrival of the dark butterfly had also proven that the scent of black turtle's blood was like a lure for hungry abominations. All they could do was wait and see if the approaching horror was of the kind that could climb onto the shell or not. That was not the reason why Sonny felt somber, though. Rather, the appearance of the 4th threat had forced him to face an eventuality that seemed more and more like the truth. That truth was that they would not be able to use the carcass of the black turtle as a ship to safely reach civilization. After all, no matter how much they had hoped that they would, it had seemed possible when there was only the azure serpent circling the island. The arrival of the dark butterfly made it questionable. The appearance of the 3rd contender was like a nail in the coffin of Sonny's hope. If there were 3, there would be 4, 5, and more. Sooner or later, one of the abominations would crawl onto the shell, discover the 2 humans, and devour them. The corner of his mouth twitched. But what can we do? They couldn't escape by water, since it was populated by unthinkable horrors. They couldn't escape by air, either, since it was just as dangerous. Even though the carcass of the black turtle was slowly starting to seem more and more like a death trap, there was no way out. He sighed. Let's just enjoy the show, for now. If I know anything about the old snake, it won't let the newcomer get close without a fight. And indeed, no sooner than he said it, the crimson water foamed, and a gargantuan head of the great river serpent rose above its surface. This time, the creature's long snout was turned away from the island, facing downstream. The mad beast was watching the patch of rough water too. What do you think it will be? Hearing the question, Nephis lingered for a moment. I don't know. It seems enormous. So, a whale? A cachalot? A giant squid, maybe? Sonny shook his head. I bet it'll be something entirely eerie, like that crawling mass of seaweed, bones, and rotten flesh that Cassie told us about on the Forgotten Shore. He paused for a moment, and then added doubtfully, also, what's a cachalot? Nephis let out a quiet sigh. It's like a whale, but with teeth. Sonny blinked a couple of times. Did whales not have teeth? He knew what a whale was, in theory, but not the details. They were all extinct, anyway, probably. Who knew what was happening in the oceans? The 2 of them watched tensely as the patch of rough water drew nearer and nearer, revealing its true size. It was indeed several kilometers wide, and much more tumultuous than it had seemed from afar. The water inside the patch seemed to be boiling, which looked rather strange considering that the river around it was as calm as ever. A minute later, the azure serpent let out an angry roar, and at the same moment, Sonny slowly rose to his feet. Curse it. The water was not really boiling, and there was no titanic behemoth moving under its surface to cause the ripples. Instead, there were thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of small creatures moving forward at a terrifying speed, coming closer and closer to the island. It had taken him so long to notice because their insect-like bodies were almost entirely translucent. Each was as long as his arm, with countless thin legs, beady black eyes, and long, disgusting mouths that were full of vicious, glass-like teeth. Standing by his side, Nephis whispered, "Krill." Sonny shifted his perception and shivered after noticing the vile darkness spreading through the bodies of the repulsive creatures. Each of them was of the corrupted rank. It was not another great behemoth that had been attracted by the scent of the black turtle's blood. Instead, it was a swarm of thousands and thousands of abhorrent corrupted beasts. Chapter 1270, Pinnacle of Strength. Even after living through the horrors of the Southern Campaign and witnessing the chilling resolution of the Battle of the Black Skull, Sonny still paled at the sight of the enormous swarm of corrupted beasts. There were too many of them to count, but there had to be tens of thousands of translucent crustaceans advancing toward the island. Even Nephis seemed taken aback, a rare sight, and not a welcome one. She instinctively outstretched a hand, as if summoning a sword could save them from the plague of corrupted abominations. It's all right. Her voice was even, but lacked confidence. Sunny forced out a faint smile. How exactly is this all right? Nephis lingered for a moment. These creatures don't seem capable of leaving the water. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment. Yes, the abominable krill were probably incapable of crawling onto the island and devouring them. However, they were more than capable of devouring the azure serpent, and with the old snake gone, nothing would prevent the dark butterfly from landing on the shell of the slain great monster. That's right, you are going to die. He flinched and glared at the Sin of Solace, who had appeared out of nowhere and looked at him with dark glee. The sword wraith laughed and then whispered, "Better yet, you are going to watch Nephis die. Isn't it poetic?" Sunny tried to ignore the vile apparition, but this time it was much harder than usual. With the words of the Sin of Solace still echoing in his ears, he forced himself to look away and stare at the river. Below them, the azure serpent lowered its head stubbornly, huffed, and suddenly shot toward the krill swarm with tremendous speed. The water parted and foamed where it passed. Sunny could not see the great beast's eyes, but he knew that they were filled with bloodlust and fury. That snake did not know when to retreat. Or rather, it never wanted to. Its lust for slaughter and destruction seemed much greater than its desire to exist. It's admirable, really. What an earnest beast. It took a special kind of lunatic to make a vice into a perverse virtue. The azure serpent's extreme bloodlust had made it into a much more fearsome existence than it should have been. But how was it going to fight tens of thousands of corrupted abominations? No matter how large its maw was and how sharp its fangs were, the serpent could only crush that many krill in its jaws. A dozen at a time, a few dozen, even 100. It was not going to make a difference. For every bite it took, 1,000 corrupted creatures were going to sink their teeth into the great beast's flesh. Even though there was a vast gap between the two ranks, it was not as insurmountable as that between the two masters and the azure serpent. It would have been different if the mad beast possessed unnatural powers, but it only possessed inconceivable physical might. Not all enemies, however, could be destroyed with pure strength. And yet, Sunny couldn't help but root for the great river serpent. Come on, old snake, do something. The swift figure of the azure leviathan was closing in on the rushing krill swarm, moments away from clashing with it. It seemed like a suicidal charge. It had to be, and yet it was not. A second before the azure serpent plunged into the mass of translucent krill, it dove down. In the next moment, Sunny and Nephis swayed, pushed back by the shock wave of a demented, enraged roar. Even distorted by the mass of water, it was still loud enough to make their ears ring and their bones vibrate. The krill, however, since they had been much closer to the source of the roar, the shock wave spread through the swarm like a battering ram. Sunny's eyes widened when he noticed numerous translucent bodies suddenly convulsing and losing their speed. The swarming abominations were stunned. Some of them, those who had been closer to the azure serpent, were paralyzed completely, while those that had been further away were at least disoriented. Sunny concentrated and extended his shadow sense as far as he could, and then a little further still. He just barely managed to sense the massive shape of the great beast flying through the restless water. That was why he sensed the mighty muscles of the serpent moving, his long body contracting like a bow. Then, its tail shot forward like a whip, and a sudden explosion sent countless tons of water rushing outward in a crushing wave. The sonic boom was even louder than the mad beast's enraged roar, and the force produced by it not only stunned the krill, but also tore many of them apart. Many more were completely obliterated by the tail of the azure serpent, but incomparably more were already rushing from all sides, aiming to bite into its massive body. The giant jaws opened and snapped, grinding 100 krill into dust. It was like a drop in the ocean. Then, the serpent did something strange. It suddenly spun, as if trying to turn its long snout into a drill. Sunny did not see how this could help the great beast against the swarm of corrupted abominations, but in the next moment, he opened his eyes wide. Following the spinning motion of the Leviathan, the waters of the great river were stirred, forming a long whirlpool along the length of its colossal body. That underwater whirlpool was like liquid armor, the current powerful enough to repel the attacking krill. The azure serpent's jaws opened again, and another roar shook the world. When they closed, numerous translucent abominations died. The battle was too furious, too grand, too inconceivable. Standing on the shell of the dead behemoth, Sunny and Nephis watched in silence as a lone great beast resisted myriads of corrupted creatures. Looking at the foaming water, they couldn't help but feel small and weak and insignificant. Unnatural powers? Humans were bestowed with aspect abilities despite being mere beasts, but nightmare creatures were different. Only devils possessed dire powers similar to those of an aspect. The azure serpent was not a devil, and did not possess a sinister ability. However, it was not powerless. Instead of relying on an unnatural power, it relied on its terrifying body, absolute control over it, and a deep understanding of its natural domain to make the river itself a power. Sunny had been wrong. The azure serpent did possess a weapon to use against an enemy that could not be crushed through pure strength. That weapon was its mastery of water. This is it. I see now. I understand. He had spent countless hours trying to comprehend the azure serpent, but always felt that a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing. A fundamental truth that was at the root of all other insights, and without which they were meaningless. Now, Sunny finally felt that he had found the thread which had to be pulled to unravel the mystery. Below them, the ancient Leviathan was fighting against a harrowing swarm of abominable krill. The battle had only just begun, and there was no saying which side would win, and which side would be destroyed. The azure serpent possessed a dire weapon, but was that weapon enough to survive the onslaught of tens of thousands of corrupted beasts? One way or the other, they were going to know soon. Chapter 1271. The Krill. The battle between the azure serpent and the krill swarm did not last long, but it was the most terrifying event Sunny had seen since entering the third nightmare. The great beast completely lost its mind as it fought the legion of vile abominations. Stirred by its fury, the water seethed and roiled, sometimes exploding into colossal fountains of scarlet foam, sometimes rising in titanic waves. The magnitude of these undulations was so severe that the whole island rocked and swayed like a ship caught in the middle of a world-ending storm. The cacophony of wrathful roars and thunderous sonic booms merged into a deafening litany, to the point that both Sunny and Nephis were forced to plug their ears. Thousands of attacking krill were destroyed, but the swarm did not seem diminished at all. Instead, no matter how furiously the azure serpent fought, more and more abominations were lunging at it, their thin legs moving in gluttonous anticipation. At first, the water armor the Leviathan had created protected its prodigious body, but eventually it failed. One krill struggled past the repelling current of the whirlpool, then 2, then 100. Their teeth scraped powerlessly against the impenetrable azure scales. However, after suffering through 3 dire battles with the dark butterfly, the azure serpent was battered and littered with wounds. Its body had already been covered by countless scars before, and now there were numerous new ones. Some scales were broken, some cracked, and some were missing entirely. It was only a matter of time before one of the krill managed to draw blood, then 2, then 100. Even though their size was minuscule in comparison to the great river serpent, they were corrupted abominations nevertheless, and their painful bites added up. The pain did not slow the azure serpent down, though. Instead, it became even more enraged, even more deranged, even more frenzied. The battle, which had already been frightening to look at, suddenly exploded in intensity, reaching a realm that went beyond fear. Standing on the swaying shell of the black turtle, Sunny and Nephis watched the boiling river with pale faces. Before Sunny knew what was happening, he found himself holding Neph's hand. He did not know which one of them grasped the other's hand first, but felt that this simple touch was his only lifeline in a world that had lost all reason. He also did not know how much time had passed. All Sunny knew was that the battle was changing. The azure serpent did not manage to destroy the krill swarm. However, the swarm had also failed to consume the serpent, but their goal was not the mad Leviathan in the first place. The serpent was rampaging in the waters infested by the krill, but the swarm was simply too vast. Thousands of abominations at its edges simply rushed past the great beast and continued toward the carcass of the black turtle, their translucent bodies turning crimson as they dove into the cloudy red water. Noticing that, the azure serpent let out an infuriated roar, but there was little it could do. The main mass of the swarm surrounded it like a cage, and no matter how forcefully it slammed into its shifting barrier, it couldn't break free. Suddenly, Sunny felt a purifying warmth enter his body and soul. Looking down, he saw a soft glow rising from his skin and glanced at Nephis with a silent question. Her lips seemed dry. "Bow, I think you should summon your bow." He lingered for a moment, and then his eyes glinted darkly. Sparks of light ignited around his hand and formed into a black bow with a scarlet string. Then, an arrow that was like a bolt of lightning appeared out of nothing. Drawing Morgan's warbow, Sunny aimed at the seething mass of the approaching krill and let the strike of thunder loose. The lightning flashed toward the crimson water and exploded, sending arcs of electricity flying across the surface of the river. The monstrous krill were about the length of Sunny's arm, with carapaces so thin that they appeared transparent. Still, they were corrupted beasts, so their shells were tough enough to resist a direct hit from a railgun, and their teeth were sharp enough to tear through armored MWPs as if they were made from paper. But Sunny and his bow were augmented both by the shadows and the soul flame, granting his arrow tremendous power, which was why he soon heard a familiar voice whispering into his ear. River locust, river locust. Oh my, nice, and when man come at home time, Without stopping to listen to the spell, Sunny sensed a flood of shadow fragments pouring into his soul and drew the string of the warbow again. He did not hope to stop the advance of the krill swarm, and neither did he hope to help the azure serpent prevail. Even if Sunny killed 100 abominations, he wouldn't be putting a tiny dent in the swarm. Rather, what he was doing was pure opportunism. Nephis needed to burn the enemy with her flames, or consume the soul shard like a normal awakened to receive fragments, but Sunny just needed a kill, so he could just as well use the opportunity to strengthen himself. Sunny managed to fire off a few soul arrows and the strike of thunder once more before the krill reached the black turtle, reaping a rich harvest of lives. Then, however, it became too dangerous to remain near the edge of the island. Even though the revolting creatures could not crawl out of the water, they showed themselves capable of jumping out of it with enough force to propel their translucent bodies through the air. After one of the krill landed a mere dozen or so meters away from them and scurried forward before being pierced by a black arrow, Sunny and Nephis decided to retreat. Below them, thousands of corrupted beasts were fruitlessly trying to bite into the impregnable black scales of the dead behemoth. Some, however, were already swimming into the gaping wound under its flipper. Further away, the azure serpent finally managed to break the cage of the greatly diminished swarm and shot through the water in pursuit. It looked terribly mangled, bleeding from 1,000 tiny bites. Some of the krill even seemed to have burrowed into the open wounds, just like the serpent itself had burrowed into the body of the black turtle before. Despite that, the great beast seemed just as murderous and consumed by madness as ever. The old snake did it. It actually won? Even though many krill had managed to reach the carcass and swim inside, the swarm was undeniably broken. The Azure Serpent and the two humans it was hunting were going to live another day. Chapter 1272, Paradise Lost. That night, the island was quaking without pause. Sunny and Nephis hid in their fissure, not daring to close their eyes, even though a mass of impregnable black rock separated them from the flesh of the black turtle. It was unnerving to know that thousands of corrupted beasts were currently slithering somewhere below them, shredding the meat of the great monster with their terrible glass-like teeth. The Azure Serpent was also there, hunting down the invaders. Although they couldn't hear its roars, the violent vibrations spreading through the island told them what was going on. Sunny looked away from the shimmering runes, somewhat startled at how easily he had earned a large amount of shadow fragments. After another violent tremor had shaken the island, he finally closed his eyes. However, it was not to sleep. Instead, Sunny tried to convince himself that he was the Azure Serpent. He was crawling through the grotesque tunnel of bleeding flesh, which he himself had created to kill the hateful carapace monster, furiously hunting the vile creatures who dared to steal his trophy. His long, mighty body was burning from pain, but Sunny did not care. All he cared about was slaughter, blood, and retribution. Noticing a tiny worm gnawing on the wall of the tunnel, he let out a terrifying growl and shot forward, destroying the vermin and tearing a large chunk of meat out of the wall with his powerful jaws. But, behind it, more vermin were revealed, stolen meat digesting in their transparent stomachs. With madness painting the cloudy world red, Sunny roared and slammed into them with obliterating fury. Is this the feeling? Am I on the right path? Opening his eyes, he stared into the darkness with an absent expression. Then, he looked at Nephis. Sometime later, Sunny said, "I feel like our chances of making it off this island alive are dwindling." She remained silent for a while. So what if they are? White flames ignited in her eyes, illuminating them with a pale radiance. Has it been any different before? Hearing that, Sunny chuckled. True, we never had it easy. He studied her face, then turned to look at the sin of solace and sighed. Still, I hope that this nightmare will be better than my second one. Oh, it's not much of a competition. I must have died 1,000 times there, even though I only remember a handful of those deaths. The third nightmare surely can't turn out any worse than that. Nephis turned and looked at him, then smiled faintly. Of course, in the worst case, we'll just die once. That's nothing, right? As the dark island shook and quaked around them, Sunny grinned. Dying once? Child's play. Gods. Anyone can do it. You're right. I was worried about nothing. As they laughed quietly, the sin of solace smiled too. His smile was bright and full of sinister amusement. The next day after the attack of the krill swarm, the butterfly descended from the skies again, and 2 days after that, another flying abomination appeared silently in the darkness of the night. Neither Sunny nor Nephis saw it. But in the morning, the surface of the island was awash with black, fetid blood. It seemed that it was the butterfly that had battled the late contender this time, ripping it to shreds before it had the chance to approach the remains of the black turtle. It must have taken an injury in that battle, because the Azure Serpent received more days than usual to recover from its dire wounds. Then, as they drifted further downstream, a second krill swarm attacked, this one even larger than the first. The battle between the mad Leviathan and the vast river locust swarm lasted for an entire day, and its result was pretty much the same. Thousands of translucent abominations slithered into the carcass of the black turtle, and the battered serpent followed to hunt them down. However, what met it inside was another great beast, a vile creature made of numerous tentacles and spongy pale flesh that had snuck to feast on the insides of the turtle while the river serpent had been fighting the krill. Sunny and Nephis knew how it looked because the Azure Serpent brought its revolting body outside and rose high above the water before swallowing the corpse whole. That was how they learned why a powerful earthquake had suddenly thrown the world into spasms and convulsions before. On that day, to their horror, they discovered a deep crack snaking its way through the surface of the black turtle's shell. It was not too large, but the fact that the stone carapace of the dead monster had been broken from the inside was indescribably concerning. Next morning, Nephis went to the edge of the island instead of practicing with Sunny, as they usually did, and spent several hours staring at the water. Then she brought back disturbing news. The carcass of the black turtle was higher than it had been before. The parts of it that had been hidden underwater were now dry and exposed. This meant that a considerable amount of the dead behemoth's flesh had already been devoured by the Azure Serpent, the marauding krill, and the pale thief, thus reducing its weight and increasing its buoyancy. It was also the reason why the swaying and the shaking of the island had grown much more severe lately. The carapace of the black turtle was deteriorating and cracking under the strain of harrowing battles raging around and inside of it, and at the same time it was being gradually hollowed out by the nightmare creatures of the great river. Their titanic shelter was slowly coming undone under them. Worse yet, in the coming days, the number of abominations arriving to feast on the corpse of the titanic monster only increased. There were more krill, more dwellers of the deep, and more winged horrors being lured to it by the scent of blood. It was a carnival of horror. The azure serpent and the dark butterfly were like champions among them, slaying all invaders and occasionally clashing with each other. But that only made the situation worse. Now, the dreadful inhabitants of the great river were attracted not only by the blood of the black turtle, but also by the blood of unfortunate abominations that had been slain in their attempt to feast on the turtle's meat. This can't go on much longer, it just can't. Both Sunny and Nephis knew that doom was swiftly approaching. However, there was nothing they could do. No matter how much they hoped and how diligently they watched the horizon, there was no sign of anything that could save them. There was no land and no ships anywhere in sight. There was not even a piece of flotsam drifting on the waves, only a vast, deep, and endlessly flowing expanse of water that shone under the dreamlike radiance of the 7 beautiful suns. Chapter 1273 Collapse. Sunny, wake up! Sunny opened his eyes and tensed. Sensing the world through the shadows, he couldn't feel any danger, but there was urgency in Neff's voice. Something was wrong. As his mind entered a state of battle readiness, he pushed himself off the ground and briefly studied the fissure. It was still night, so everything was enveloped in deep darkness. That darkness, of course, could not hinder his sight. Sunny saw every detail of their small camp and of the weathered walls of black rock surrounding it. Everything seemed fine. Saint, who was guarding them from high above, was also calm. He turned to Nephis and asked, "What is going on?" She pressed a finger against her lips and whispered. There was a sound. The next moment he heard it too, a dull, echoing crackle that came from somewhere below, spreading through the rock in a subtle vibration, like a stone breaking. He frowned. What is this? Sunny and Nephis froze, listening to the eerie sounds coming from within the carapace of the black turtle. They had not dared to venture there after salvaging the meat. The shell had been hollowed out, but they didn't know by how much, and even though they had heard the sounds of nightmare creatures inside the carcass of the great monster from time to time, this crackling was entirely new. A small whirlwind of sparks appeared in the air, manifesting into a softly glowing paper lantern. Placing it on the lid of the covetous coffer, Nephis lowered her head and pressed her ear to the ground. There was another cracking sound, and she suddenly flinched. At the same time, Sunny's pupils narrowed as he noticed something that was out of place in their fissure. A small, thin crack appeared on the floor of the ravine. Just as Neph flinched, it suddenly grew, spreading through the black rock in both directions. Then it climbed a few meters up the wall, and when the cracking noise disappeared, a small piece of rock splintered and tumbled down. Neph's face suddenly grew pale. I think it's going to break. Before she could finish, there was another sound, this one so loud that it was almost deafening. Sunny felt the ground suddenly shift under him, and then the entire island shook violently. It's breaking! Before he even knew what was happening, Sunny jumped. As Nephis and he soared into the air, the floor of the fissure below them suddenly split and collapsed, revealing a vast cavern of darkness and crimson flesh below. Their small camp was instantly swallowed, except for the memories like the coffer that were dismissed and disappeared in a whirlwind of sparks. Everything else, the fire pit, the sleeping bag, the bed made of soft moss, and the rest of it, fell into the darkness in a rain of stone shards. But the collapse was not over yet. As Sunny collided against the vertical wall of the fissure and grabbed onto the rocks, the walls tilted too. A horrible stench of blood entered his nostrils, and he saw the small crack he had noticed before expanding. Countless new ones appeared, as well, and the entire ravine suddenly moved. God damn it! Struggling to outrun the disaster, Sunny pushed himself off the wall and jumped higher. He was aiming to repeat the process and send himself to the surface with the next jump, but the spot that he was aiming for suddenly broke off and plummeted down in an avalanche of stone. Cursing, Sunny manifested the shadows to create a foothold instead. A split second later, he flew out of the fissure, rolled on the ground, then dashed back to its edge and grabbed Neff's hand, helping her climb out. As soon as they rolled away in a heap, the entire edge split off and crumbled down. A panicked thought that the entire island was falling apart entered Sunny's mind. However, the devastation was not as absolute. As the two of them watched, the landscape of the black turtle's shell was changing. It seemed that the schism originated from the location below the central region where their camp had been located. Wide cracks spread through the black stone, and a wide surface either crumbled entirely or at least sank, forming deep craters. The rest of the island was affected too, but to a smaller degree. It was just a chain reaction that forced the ground to tilt and slide into the water by a few meters. Nevertheless, their shelter was still afloat. Sonny belatedly realized that he was practically laying on Nephis. Their limbs were entangled, and both of them were covered in stone dust. Struggling to breathe, he slowly pushed himself away and stood up. A couple moments later, she followed. Standing dazedly above the newly formed pit, Sonny and Nephis looked down with bleak faces. Their camp, where they had spent so many peaceful nights, was gone. Much worse, the dark island was showing signs of breaking apart. It was just a part of the central region today, but there would be more collapses in the future. Eventually, the entire shell would crumble, leaving them stranded and lost in the sea of deadly abominations. After almost a month of peace, they finally reached a true crisis. Sonny and Nephis looked at each other, not knowing what to say. Eventually, he broke the silence. "We need to get off this island." Nephis lingered for a moment. "Yes, but how?" Sonny looked away with a dark expression. He didn't know. It was not as if they had not been preparing for this inevitable situation. They had tried to come up with a feasible plan dozens of times. However, there was no such plan to come up with. The azure serpent was still waiting for them in the water, and the dark butterfly was still ruling over the sky. Worse than that, many more abominations were prowling the surrounding waters, including the harrowing swarms of krill. If the island sank, they were going to die. If it didn't sink, the azure serpent would eventually be killed, and they would be devoured by either the monstrous butterfly or some other great nightmare creature. There seemed to be no escape. Staring into the pit filled with stone rubble, Sonny sighed. Now, it finally feels like a real nightmare. A sad smile appeared on his pale face. Chapter 1274, Time of Truth. The 7 suns were shining in the azure sky. Sonny was sitting close to the slope of the island, staring fixedly at the flowing water. His eyes were dark and tired. With the temporary camp destroyed, he felt strangely homeless. Much worse, neither he nor Nephis had managed to come up with a viable solution for their fatal problem. They had considered many things. Every memory in their possession had been studied and examined, but none of them, nor any combination of them, revealed a way out of the perilous situation. The best they could hope for was prolonging their stay on the carapace of the black turtle somewhat. They could use the dark shaper to try and repair the cracks in the stone shell. There were other unreliable measures as well, but that would just buy them a few more days at most. There were other memories that they could use to try to escape, but attempting escape was tantamount to suicide. The great nightmare creatures guarding both the water and the sky were not something they could outrun. Then, there were Sonny's shadows. He had once thought that Saint was their best hope of slaying the azure serpent. However, after witnessing the mad beast in battle, he didn't think that the taciturn knight could achieve such a feat anymore. Not only because she could not enter the water, but also because his plan to augment her with both the shadows and the white flames had been crushed. Saint could not receive the blessing of the fire. Or rather, she could not reap its full benefits. The augmentation had worked perfectly fine in his basement before the southern campaign, but Saint underwent a fundamental transformation after that. She was now a devil whose body and soul were infused with elemental darkness. And while true darkness somehow worked in tandem with Sonny's shadows, it refused to accept Neff's light. Saint could either use one or the other. In any case, the result was not nearly as powerful as Sonny had imagined it to be. They could bestow the power of Shadow Flame on his other transcendent devil, though. Sadly, Imp was not nearly as formidable of a warrior as Saint. On top of that, the little bastard was in a coma, or a food coma, at least. The scrawny goblin had finally stopped devouring the tarnished silver and fell into a deep slumber. Sonny had a hunch that after the great mass of mystical metal was fully digested, his gluttonous fiend would grow much stronger. But there was no telling how long it would take, so he sent Imp into the nurturing black flames of his soul to complete the evolution in peace. In any case, Imp was of no help for now. The same went for Nightmare. The tenebrous steed had loyally guarded their dreams and subjugated a good number of them, but he was still an awakened terror. Even if the black stallion managed to unlock his terror ability, he was no match for a great beast, let alone a great monster like the dark butterfly. So, Sonny and Neffs had no tools that could help them escape from the shell of the black turtle, which was why Sonny was sitting on the cold stones and staring aimlessly at the water. The water was much less cloudy than it had been before. The vivid red color had receded, turning pale pink. The The black turtle only had so much blood, after all, and by now most of it had dissolved in the endless current of the great river. As he looked, the water suddenly foamed, and a giant serpentine head rose from its depths. A familiar gaze pierced him, brimming with hatred and madness. The azure serpent did not look too good. Just like the carcass of the black turtle, which had once seemed grand and indestructible, was now pitiful and hollow. The great beast was in a dire state. One of its cloudy eyes was gone, replaced by a bloody hole. Half of the terrifying fangs in its obliterating maw were either cracked or broken. Whole chunks of flesh were missing from its long neck, revealing red meat and white bone. And yet, the azure serpent was undeterred. It was just the same. Its fury was the same. Its hunger was the same. And its mad determination to kill the two humans was the same. The great beast stared at Sonny, and Sonny stared at the great beast. "Aren't you a persistent one?" His voice sounded grim and hoarse. Sonny remained silent for a while, then suddenly spat. "But what do you even know? Do you think you're so special? I know fury too. I know hunger too. I know madness too. Oh, and I've killed plenty of creatures more powerful than me too." A dark smile appeared on his face. "Who are you to dare stare me down, beast? I am lost from light, who was born from the shadows. I am the rightful heir of death and the bastard son of fate. Wherever I go, ruin follows. If you had any sense, you would have run away as soon as you saw me." He shivered slightly, then sighed. But it's too late now. What a pity." Standing behind him, the Sin of Solace laughed with disdain. "Wow, what a speech. What are you, an 8th grader?" Ignoring the apparition, Sonny looked away and stood up. There was only one way to leave the island. He had known it for a long time, but felt reluctant to admit it. However, there was no time to lie to himself anymore. Now, it was the time for the truth, no matter how hideous and terrifying it was. Walking through the crumbling landscape of the dark island, Sonny found Nephis. Despite everything, she was still practicing with her sword. The lethal blade and its master were both beautiful. The world of the great river was lethal and beautiful too. Sensing his approach, Nephis stopped and glanced at him with a composed expression. Sonny took a deep breath before coming to stand next to her, looking into her eyes. "I have something to say." She nodded slowly. "What is it?" Sonny lingered for a moment, then offered her his hand. "Give me your flame, all of it." Nephis frowned slightly, a hint of concern appearing in her striking gray eyes. "Why?" He looked at her silently for a while, thinking. Sonny had told the old snake that ruin followed wherever he went. But, really, he was the one following ruin around most of the time. The two of them followed each other, unable to separate, just like a shadow and a star casting it could not be separated. They were quite a pitiful pair. Eventually, he steeled his resolve. "Because I am going to kill the azure serpent." Chapter 1275, Last Resort. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. Granted, there was not much to these preparations. Sonny and Nephis were in a desperate situation, and they could only escape it by resorting to desperate means. This was going to be it. They were either going to live or die. Sonny looked at the weathered surface of the black turtle's shell as they walked to the shore. The black rock, the green moss, the deep fissures with murky water glistening in some of them. He had spent the first month of the nightmare here. It was a harrowing place, or rather, it was supposed to be harrowing. But, strangely, all he could remember about the dark island were happy memories. Training with Nephis until sweat covered their bodies and a pleasant fatigue settled in their muscles. Laying on the moss and staring at the dreamlike sky, unbothered by the movements of the world. Eating delicious meals and drinking cool, sweet water. Bathing in the warmth of a campfire as they talked to each other, surrounded by darkness. All of that was coming to an end. It already had. He was reluctant to let go of this harrowing paradise, but there was no other choice. Maybe I truly am mad. Sonny had entered the nightmare utterly crushed. From Falcon Scott to the Battle of the Black Skull, he had tasted nothing but bitter failure. He had wished to be strong. He had made this wish come true, only to find out that it was of no use in the end. As if to mock him, fate had obliterated everything. However, somehow, he had truly been content on the dark island. Sailing through a river of unholy blood on the corpse of a dreadful monster, being pulled into the past by the current, he had been happy on that journey, and happier still to share it with someone he was fond of. Was fond of so much. He had been having fun in the depths of a nightmare. So what if I'm mad? He would need madness to survive today. The three of them, Sonny and Nephis and Saint, reached the slope of the island. Below them, the great river was flowing endlessly, bleak because of the encroaching night. The darkest hour, the brief time after the suns had already plunged into the river but before the vast expanse of clear water started to glow with soft radiance, was swiftly approaching. Sunny took a deep breath. Calm down. You've prepared for this. You've been preparing this whole time. Indeed, Sunny had not spent the whole month simply relaxing and spending idle time with Nephis. He had always known that this unexpected respite was not meant to last, and so he had been studying the azure serpent. By now, Sunny knew the mad beast much better than he knew most people. He had learned everything about it, how the serpent fought, how the serpent thought, what emotions guided it, what dark passion burned in its vile, corrupted soul. He also learned how the creature's colossal body moved and worked, down to the smallest detail, as well as how the great river serpent commanded water to turn it into a weapon. In that regard, Sunny's experience fighting side by side with the scions of the House of Night had been of great help. After coming to learn all these things, Sunny knew for a fact that he would never be able to defeat the azure serpent in a battle. But that was if the azure serpent was healthy and whole. It was not anymore. The great beast had been ravaged by the battles with the dark butterfly, the harrowing assaults of the krill swarms, and the insidious attacks of the marauding abominations. Its flesh was shredded and frayed, its strength was exhausted, and its mind was clouded by rampant madness. So, maybe, just maybe, Sunny stood a chance of emerging victorious from the fight. If he won, they would have to leave the Dark Island immediately and never look back. Otherwise, the monstrous butterfly was going to descend from the dark sky, notice them, and devour them. If he lost, he would die. At least he would die first, turning the words the Sin of Solace had whispered once into a lie. I'm ready. With a sigh, Sunny turned to Nephis and offered her a faint smile. He lingered for a few moments, then said evenly, "The next one is on you." She nodded seriously, completely missing the humorous undertone. Of course. Sunny shook his head, then took her hand, transferring the essence pearl from his soul into hers. "I was joking, you know." Nephis lingered for a moment. Suddenly, she gripped his hand tighter and looked him straight in the eyes. "I wasn't." He held her gaze for several long, poignant seconds before freeing his hand with a sigh. Then, Sunny glanced at Saint. "You know what to do." The graceful knight raised her bow with indifferent grace. She had to play an important part in the battle too. Nephis might not have been able to augment her with the white flames, but Saint had been wearing the stifled scream for an entire month. Better yet, just as Sunny had thought, sailing on the great river had a strange effect on the transcendent charm. By now, the enhancement it gifted to the taciturn shadow was much greater than it was supposed to be. Even without the augmentation of the shadow flame, she was frighteningly powerful. Finally, Sunny looked back at Nephis. "Do it." He felt the purifying warmth flowing into his body and soul, strengthening both. At the same time, all 5 of his shadows wrapped themselves around him. In an instant, Sunny felt strong enough to crush the black rocks with his bare fists and shake the entire world with his steps. Turning to the great river, he took a deep breath and whispered, "Lost from light, remember, this is your name." Then he opened the gate of the shadow lantern and allowed a flood of shadows to flow out of it, drowning the slopes of the island. They flowed down like an avalanche of darkness, eventually touching the water. Sunny closed his eyes and dissolved into the shadows. In the next moment, the shadows moved, and something tore free from their dark embrace. A giant serpent with scales as black as onyx manifested itself from the darkness and dove into the water with a deafening roar.